From a certain point in his life, he was going to live only for himself. School, studies, classmates, and so on. All this became not for him. At least he decided so then. All these thoughts were interrupted at one moment by his interlocutor, who turned to young Mr. Lihan and asked him to look straight, because it seemed to him that they had finally arrived at the place. According to the man, they arrived at the best school of magic in the entire empire, which was called Einrogard, and the man's name was Arlog, and it seemed to him that he, as an old knight, was not quite suitable to help the guy. But still, he was very glad that he had the opportunity to see how he grew up, became a wonderful young man, and entered the ranks of Einrogard students. At that moment, the guy had only disappointment in his head, that he ultimately could not break his connection with the school, even in this life. His very good friend congratulated him on his graduation. It seemed to him that this day would never come, but finally, they were able to get out of slavery. He couldn't even believe for a moment that they could survive with such professors. Likan completely agreed with him, because one could only remember the incident when he and the professor walked several kilometers and he told him to join the walking club, or when he was assigned to write an essay of several hundred pages and do it all in one night, but he simply could not refuse and again had to stay awake. But now they can finally forget about this place forever, although according to his friend, some of the guys decided to stay to work at the university as graduate students, after which his friend jokingly told him that it seemed to him that he fit perfectly into this life, so he invited him to go study further. Li Kan believed that all this was already going too far. He believed that he had already done too much for this place, so he was not going to study anywhere else. Li Kan decided that he would do everything in this life to simply live for himself and not think about anything else, so he no longer needed to be in a place like graduate school. A man driving a huge truck tried to do everything to slow down, but apparently his brakes simply failed. And this was bad news not only for him, but also for Li Kan, who at that moment decided to cross the road. At that moment, his studies and diploma ultimately turned out to be a useless piece of paper, but his intention remained unshakable even after rebirth. After this terrible accident, Li Kan woke up in a new body, but the most important thing was that he remembered every moment of his past life. But in the next life, he became not just a man, but the third son of the strongest magical house in the empire, and he simply could not believe that all this was really true. He was reborn in another world, and also an aristocrat. It really was something out of fantasy. It was impossible to say that he actually liked all this very much, because he became the third son of a rich and powerful family, and it really couldn't have been better. Lihan believed that he was rewarded for attending the university in a previous life, and for studying so hard, and it seemed to him that this was his chance to relax. But a little later it turned out that he was incredibly mistaken. After all, it is worth taking into account only the first rule of the Vardana's house, that the first son inherits everything, but the rest of the sons are obliged to determine their own path. Fortunately, the family supports all educational endeavors, so young Li Kan asked the old knight to teach him fencing because he believed it would be useful to him in the future, and besides, there was no better lesson. Arlog even suggested that he take advantage of this and take the path of the sword, but Linnuk considered this not the best idea, because he believed that he was destined to become a magician, and besides, it seemed to him that this path was more stable than the path of the sword. But then he realized that it would be better if he did not say this, because Arlog is still a knight, and it could sound too offensive and ambitious. Although the man's reaction was incredibly unexpected, because he suddenly bowed his head in front of him and began to say that he was surprised by his intelligence at such a young age. And this was not surprising because according to him, most noble children have illusions. That is, he wanted to say that they are too ambitious at a young age, but he immediately realized that Li Kan is not like that, because he takes a reasonable approach to planning the future. Li Kan realized that at least in this case, his university helped him, after completing which he began to soberly assess reality. And with such a sense of understanding, he knew that everyone from the knightly order to the adventurers guild, and even to the imperial family always welcomes capable magicians. And he and his family have a great opportunity to get into an institution where talented magicians are trained, and we are talking about the greatest academy of magic in the Einrogard Empire, in which the guy needed to hold out for a couple more years, and it was so simple for him because he would have to study again. But he promised himself that he would try to do it. Arlog was confident that he would do a good job, because even the patriarch praised the talent of young Li Kan. But Lihan was not going to believe all this, because he said this after he was not allowed to practice magic, since it was dangerous for children. But in any case, he was grateful to the knight for his kind words. The man still believed that this was the pure truth, but on this, he wished him only good luck, because the horses and accompanying people could not go any further, and Li Kan went to this school of magicians without much regret. But as soon as he entered the territory of this academy, the first thing he was surprised by was that there were so many people there. And after a few minutes, it became clear to him that Einregard is a place that you can actually enter more than one. But suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a guy who was standing next to him and was literally shaking. So Li Han couldn't help but ask if he was okay. The fact was that the guy could not stay even for several hours without his servants. According to him, he could not even sleep. This strange guy literally proved to Li Kan that they were like air to him, and he couldn't live without them. Li Kan didn't know what to answer him, because it was so strange to him. And in general, all these nobles were strange people. But what angered him even more was that, for the sake of equality, they accepted slaves for training, and he was going to take advantage of his family's position to complain about this. And Li Han was very interested to know how he would do this. The magician the guy approached used only one spell, which stopped the guy in his tracks, after which he generally began to say that he repented and completely agreed that he was wrong. For Li Han, it was surprising that they did not hesitate to use such a spell on the nobles, and apparently the rumors about this academy were true. Rumors said that it was full of monsters, and that if you died in this academy, your body would be buried in the mountains behind the academy. How all the attention was drawn to the huge gates, which at one moment opened and someone welcomed all the new students to Einregard. Li Kan immediately felt an incredibly strong magical pressure, and apparently it came from the rumored director. Looking at the other students, he understood why they suddenly froze with tension, after which suddenly the director once again reminded each of them that they had to enter this place alone, but apparently no one listened to him. After which he decided that since they did not want to obey the rules, he would force them to do so. And so, with the help of magic, he literally began to drag into the academy all the horses and all the things that other students had brought with them. Some of them shouted that if he sent his servants away, then there would be no one to serve them. Others shouted that they were so sorry for the clothes they took to this academy. After this act, he asked them a question in which he wanted to know why they were crowded together like a herd of sheep, and asked them to enter as soon as possible. This is how Li Kan's first day at Einregard, the greatest academy of magic in the empire, began. And he didn't have a very good feeling about this, but he couldn't do anything about it. Li Kan followed everyone and was completely in his thoughts, until he was distracted by someone's voice calling his name, so he had to turn around to see who spoke to him. And it was a small girl who introduced herself as Ina Macon, and she was from the Macon house, which, like the Lakhanov house, was the house of magicians. Li Han politely answered her that he was glad to meet you and would like to know what she wanted, to which she replied that His Imperial Highness would like to see him. The guy didn't quite understand what the prince needed from him, but apparently he'd have to come over. Although one thing Li Kan still understood was that they were already resolutely trying to establish connections on the very first day. He thought it was too much to call this guy Imperial Highness, because the Emperor himself actually has more than 100 children, and even in the Imperial family, everyone is only interested in the firstborn, and the Emperor himself does not support his children in any way, so they have it even worse. But what was most interesting for Li Han was that in crowded places, full of children of great houses like here, the imperial family stands even lower than other houses. Even below Yenna Macon's house, Li Kan didn't understand why she behaved like this. Li Han meant that he doesn't understand why she is helping some unknown prince, but in any case, it was worth considering that this was much better than making enemies. So he shook hands and said that there was nothing wrong with making new acquaintances. The girl was incredibly glad that he thought so, because as it turned out, he was the first to react this way. And apparently, it was because this prince's name is Gainando, and he insists that he is the 97th prince of the empire, although they say that he may be the 101st. But the guy himself insists that he is the 97th, and it was obvious that he simply does not want to leave the first 100 children. Li Kan thought about it so much that he completely listened to what Gainando was telling him, and he said something about how several guys had already rejected him, and one of them was standing there. And he himself simply didn't understand how they dared, because he was the prince of the imperial family. Li Kan told him that they must simply not know that he was of porphyry blood, but Gainando once again proved that he was immature, because he did not even know what this complex word meant. Therefore, Li-han had to explain that this word meant an important person from the upper or prestigious class, and now Gainando had a smile on his face again, because he believed that it suited him well. Then he pointed his finger at the guys who refused his offer, and now they are talking with Adanarta, and for him it was humiliating. And all this was because Adanarta was the 44th princess of the empire. She was his sister, but the relationship between them was not the best. Li-han, looking at her, thought that she has the elegance characteristic of the imperial family, so of course people are drawn to her, unlike some others. Gainando interrupted his thoughts and asked the guy to deal with her. But Lacan immediately tried to explain to him that noble people do not bully other people, so he will not do this. But he assured Lacan that he was not asking him to mock her, but simply to teach her a lesson once. But the guy believed that this is not what noble people do. Then Gainando didn't understand what to do and what to do next. Although Lacan didn't understand what was so difficult about it, because it was enough to just pass by. And if he so badly wants to get even with them, then Lacan invited him to challenge them to a duel. The guy thought that he shouldn't go that far, and since he is a noble prince, this time he will show mercy towards them, and therefore decided to forgive them. Yenna called Li-han amazing, because for her it was incredibly surprising that he was able to curb the stubbornness of this prince, because even she, as his relative, could not do this. In response, Li-kan decided to find out why she is trying to take care of him, even considering the fact that they are relatives. But before she could answer, the skull and that overwhelming aura appeared in the room again. The director again turned to the iron-headed students, who at that moment were enjoying the conversation. Other students immediately noticed that they had already seen this lich today at the gates of the academy. Li-kan knew very well that this was not just a lich. This creature was the result of the efforts of a great magician who wanted to become undead and bypass death. But even he really couldn't think that the director of the academy would be a lich. The director suddenly wanted to ask them a question in which he wanted to know why, in their opinion, he calls them ironheads. Adanarta was the first to raise her hand and said that the answer to this question is quite simple, all because the symbol of this year's newcomers is iron. In response, the director praised her and added 10 points to her department, which was quite surprising for her. But after a few seconds, the director upset her, saying that it was actually just a joke, and if she wants to become a magician, then first, she needs to learn to distinguish truth from lies. Although she is still right that iron is really the symbol of this year's newcomers, because it is a material that changes depending on what is made of it, and in fact it is very valuable and can be used for different purposes. That's why it's so suitable for beginners, and it was all so convincing that Gainando looked at the lich with his mouth open, who after a few seconds started laughing again and telling them that they were fooled again, because the reason their symbol is iron is because there is nothing in their heads. Li-kan liked only one thing in this situation. Although he mocked them, no one dared to answer him, because in fact it is extremely difficult to even move in this thick magical energy. Fortunately, the guy was already used to this because in his past life he often encountered, although not with magical energy, but professors who behaved even worse, so it was much easier for him than for other guys. At some point, the director noticed that apparently he was putting too much pressure on them, and they were only after a long journey. And while he was talking about this, he noticed how Lacan was able to move in this thick energy, which was incredibly surprising for him, because none of the newcomers had been able to do this before. In any case, now he asked each of them to pay attention to the door on the left, behind which was hidden a huge dining room, on the tables of which there was a lot of food. The director asked them not to be shy and enjoy the feast and thus get rid of fatigue. This obviously caused joy in most, because many were already hungry. They sat down at the table and only hoped that now this was not another joke from the director, and this was all real food. After all, in fact, there was a lot of things there. White bread with a thick piece of cheese and butter, a plump chicken coated in oils, butter, spices, and flour, then simmered in wine to create a delicious flavor, and a lot of other things that the students could enjoy with pleasure, and Gainando was the first to sit down at the table and decide to taste it all. But as soon as they brought the cutlery to the food, all these delicious-looking dishes literally melted into the air, and there was nothing left of them. This, as it turned out, was just another joke from the director, and they were just fools who were fooled once again. Li-kan, at that moment, was thinking about what he had heard that when you become a lich, you lose some things, and for some reason, he was sure that the director had lost a lot of things. The director continued to say that this academy is the cradle of magicians, and the strongest impulse in the development of magicians is hunger, after which clothes and various kinds of scraps literally fell on them, and according to the director, this is their food and uniform. Gainan thought that this was too much. With these words, he literally called the director to him, who, as it turned out, was just waiting for these words. After which he made it clear to them that if the food seemed disgusting to them, then they should do everything to study magic and create delicious food themselves with the same form. He immediately told them that if they want something or don't like something, then it can only be corrected through magic. These are the rules of this academy. One of the students suddenly noticed the fact that they could actually ask for all this from the outside, but as it turned out, the director was ready to hear these words, and he began to talk about how newcomers were forbidden to go outside. They are also prohibited from contacting senior students whom they may see at the academy. At this point, his teachings ended, and before disappearing, he wished them good luck and said that he would hope that they would become great magicians. Lycan could not understand whether it was really a rule of life written down somewhere that all educational institutions must have an insane professor, and the guy, unfortunately, knew this type of people. Before the rebirth, the professor in the neighboring laboratory had the same sparkle in his eyes and they were full of madness. Gainanda simply did not understand how they dare treat them like this, although Li Harn believed that this lich was much better than the professor he had in his previous life. The prince didn't care about this lich. He was now more interested in the question of how they could live with such disgusting food and clothes. Li Khan at this time was thinking that in fact, this place was much better than what he had before his rebirth, because here they gave out not only food, but also clothes, and he considered this place to be definitely better. Noble society knows little about the House of Vardanaz, all because they are completely absorbed in the study of magic and never participate in public activities. Because of this, misunderstandings are accumulating about them. Even now, Gainandu did not understand at all what was happening to him, and why Li Khan stood so strangely and pretended to be lost in thought. In any case, he tapped him on the shoulder and said that when he had the opportunity, he could come and visit him. Einregard accepts students regardless of their title, provided they have talent, however, in order to prevent conflicts between sensitive teenagers. The dormitory is divided into 4 towers, according to the status of the residents. The first tower was called the Overdimensional Blue Dragon Tower, and only people of high origin could enter here. Famous nobles, such as the Emperor's children and Li Han, will live here. Next was the Tower of a Phoenix burning from the inside. Only those who dedicated everything to the holy flame could enter here. This is a holy and righteous tower, where only priests from various religious orders can be located. The next tower was the Lightning White Tiger Tower, which only those with the rage to slay anything could enter. And in this tower live those who come from knightly houses. These people are prepared to follow 2 roads, chivalry and magic. Next door there was a tower of a black turtle, which saw the past and the future. Only those with limitless patience could enter this tower. Here there are various people, townspeople, servants, slaves, clowns, beggars, merchants, and new nobles of the lower class. Unlike other dorms, they are simply ignored due to their low status. Therefore, almost all the newcomers who got into this tower were intimidated and no one wanted to talk or communicate with them. However, there is always an exception, and it was Li Khan, in whose eyes they are ideal business partners. It seemed to him that he needed to make friends with them, because he believed that the easiest way to earn money was to run a business, and to succeed, you need experience. This is the basis of running a business. His thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a voice unknown to him, which said that he simply did not understand why there was a need to accept such low-grade people. And this was a guy from a fairly high-status family who clearly considered himself better than them. Li Han didn't understand how he even dared to mock his future business comrades, so he immediately decided to answer him that, if anyone here is low-grade, it's him. The guy once again decided to remind them that they left behind everything they owned before coming here, but apparently they forgot about it and continued to be insolent. Some guys from other houses knew that he was from the Vardanaz house, and such behavior was worthy for him, so they supported him. Li Han believed that this was a good atmosphere, and now all he had to do was finish what he started. But the guys from the Dark Turtle Tower suddenly started screaming, because they realized the fact that this guy was from the House of Vardanaz, who in their opinion was incredibly dangerous. And all this was because they heard that their patriarch was a dragon, and also that their family originated from ancient spirits, who were always a great danger. Li Khan did not expect quite such a reaction, but Yenna thought that this was normal, because he is a man of noble blood. He didn't quite understand why she was saying this. Did he really look that scary? She didn't really mean it. She told him that he showed the nobility that is characteristic of a nobleman, but even after that, Li-han didn't quite understand what he was talking about, because he didn't know how famous his family was yet. Before Li-kan had time to ask Yenna another question, they were suddenly interrupted by Gainando, who did not understand how they could leave him alone and asked to urgently return to him. They were not against doing this, and on the way, Li-kan would like to find out from the girl a little more about what she had just tried to tell him about this strange night. Yenna immediately told him that the matter here was only about his mother, which was unexpected for Li-kan. One day, Yenna ran unannounced into the imperial banquet, where she accidentally poured her drink on a woman. As it turned out later, this woman was an empress, and the little girl began to understand that it seemed like the end of the Makin house, and other people at this ball believed that the fact that she was a girl did not justify her action. But the empress herself did not think so, who took the little girl in her hand and told her that there was nothing wrong with it. And besides, all people make mistakes in life. But then it turned out that Yenna made up this whole story especially for Li-kan, and in fact the prince pays her a lot of money for being friendly with him. Li-kan decided that if this was the case, then he also urgently needed to make friends with this prince. While the guys were walking around the territory of the academy, they could not believe that it could be so huge, because there was a lake, a forest, and even small mountains. Li-kan now understood what the director was talking about when he tried to convey to them that they should get everything themselves. Suddenly they stopped, and Li-kan decided to ask Yenna what was the matter, because it seemed to him that they needed to go further, and then they would find themselves in the Tower of the Blue Dragon. But as it turned out, they were just following other guys who stopped to look at something special, which also amazed Li-kan. It was a small and incredibly poor tower, which apparently is one of the dormitories. But it was not clear who it was for, apparently for slaves and servants. At least that's what people from famous families said. But as it turned out, it was the Tower of the Blue Dragon, where they would live. Gainando could not believe his eyes, because the chambers of his servants were much larger than this tower. Li-han was more interested in the fact that it was very small for so many people, so they were unlikely to fit in. But as soon as he stepped into this tower, at some point everything around disappeared, and his body seemed to be transported to some additional space. He didn't fully understand what was going on here until he heard someone's rather strange voice telling him welcome. And then the most interesting thing happened. This strange voice decided to ask Li-kan where he was going and where did he go. After this question, Li-kan began to understand what was going on and what was happening. As expected in the Magic Academy, the dormitory is a magic tower, so Li-han decided to first clarify where he could send him. This magical guide immediately noticed that the guy adapts quite quickly, and it's quite pleasant to watch. In any case, Li-kan was informed that right now the only places he could go were firstly his room, and the second option is the iron breaking room, exclusive for first years. Li-kan decided to notice that in the future there will be other places where you can go, and this strange voice confirmed this information, and also added that for some places you only need to know their name, and for others, you will need to know something that they won't know other. But this voice immediately made him understand that this would not happen for now, if only because the director forbade him to do this, so the guy had to ask to be taken to the room. This magical assistant accepted his wish and carried him into the room, simultaneously saying, "Welcome to the academy, young magician." After some time getting acquainted with the rules of the academy, Li-har realized that with the exception of key subjects, the rest of the classes can be taken by choice, and they will be given a month of time to decide. He also learned that the director's name was Osu Gonadaltz, and this prompted the guy to think that, in fact, everything here was not so strict. In this academy, it was easier than in the graduate school that was offered to him. Besides, he liked everything here, because at least here the rooms are very spacious, and they have absolutely everything you need. But only Li-kan thought so. His friends whom he met believed that this was a damned place, and there was absolutely nothing in the rooms that they needed. At this point, the rules were clear to the guy, so he thought about why he shouldn't find out what classes others had signed up for. In the rest room, he met with Yenna, from whom he wanted to find out what she would like to study, to which she confidently answered him that most of all she would like to study alchemy. Since the girl had always been interested in her, and her dream was to establish her own workshop and supply products to the imperial family, for Li-han it sounded quite profitable. As soon as she heard that the guy liked this idea, she immediately invited him to work with her. But according to him, alchemy is a rather difficult business, and he needs to think about it. The alchemy industry in the empire was highly competitive, from spreading bad rumors about competitors to monopolizing elixir ingredients, with countless guilds fighting for market share. His thoughts were interrupted by a girl who would like to ask him what subject interests him. This question put the guy a little at a dead end, but mentally he always understood that he would choose a subject that would be less in demand and easier to learn. Therefore, his main goal was to become an imperial officer. In other words, a civil servant. The field was not really important to him. Grades and qualifications mattered. He believed that such a passionate girl would be upset if she heard such things, so for now, he did not tell her this. And he decided to say that for now he was planning to try everything first, within a month, because he was sure that it was better not to rush with important decisions. And while he was talking about this, Gainando ran out to them, who was literally shouting about that they had big problems. And the thing was that it seemed to him that a thief had been in his room, because everything was gone from there. It was completely empty. But somehow, no one paid attention to his screams, because they all understood that in fact, this was normal. The next day they had their first lesson in basic magic, and Leacher understood perfectly well that this was the main subject in the first year of study. But at that moment he was thinking that everyone in the dorm has their own preference for how to spend their free time. But he still didn't understand what was wrong with all of them. Ina didn't understand why he was so cheerful, because they were all just hungry, and besides, their beds were incredibly uncomfortable, so they didn't get enough sleep. Licker really didn't understand why it was so difficult for them, because compared to their past life, these were flowers. He always remembered the time when he was told that he would have to spend the allotted time for lunch at work, and so that he would not be so sad, he was given an energy bar. Likar didn't really know how to react to this, because it seemed to him that this was already some kind of slavery. Therefore, he actually had something to compare with, and in this place it was several times better. Finally, the guys approached their audience, and they were so grateful to the gods that it was on the first floor. But as soon as they opened the doors, their happy faces immediately changed. They literally began to fall over in shock because of what they saw there. They were sure that this was their audience, but there, the troll woman scared them so much. Trolls are fierce and dangerous monsters, notorious even to aristocrats who are very concerned about their safety. And yet, knowing this, Lihar also could not believe that in their audience, there was a troll dressed in ordinary clothes, who was also glad to see them, and invited each of them to sit down in their seats. Although they were not sure of their safety, they still occupied all the free seats in this lecture hall. After which this woman introduced herself as Garcia, and she is a half-breed. She also immediately assured them that she understood their fear. But they had nothing to fear, because, according to her, she does not eat people. But then she changed her mind and said that this would happen until she got very hungry. Now Lihar had to tense up a little, because he didn't understand whether she would eat them in the end or not. Of course it was a joke, but she immediately regretted saying it, because the faces of these guys became even paler. In any case, it's time for them to start the lecture, and she started it with the fact that most of them have never used magic before. This is due to the fact that it is extremely dangerous, and therefore only adults are allowed to use it. But she was in a hurry to please them that they were magic seeds that received the title of iron. So the purpose of her lecture was to explain the essence of magic, and also to help them determine what type of magic they were predisposed to. She immediately warned them that the path to magic is very difficult and harsh, but she wants to become a compass for them that will show them the way. Likan was very surprised that not all the professors here looked like the director. Garcia, meanwhile, decided to start from the very beginning, and therefore wanted to find out from them what magic is. One girl decided to answer that this is what magicians use to change the world with their will. Garcia noted that this is a good answer. But still, she wanted to add a little that this uses magical energy, also known as mana, the fundamental force for changing the world, and those who entered the academy are talented enough to sense this energy and recognize it. Garcia also did not forget to say that to use mana, you will need to summon magical energy with your will and carefully weave it together to cast a spell. Garcia believed that it was widely believed that this required singing or speaking, but in reality their own will was much more important, so she asked them not to forget about it. After which she said that she had actually already told them a lot, so she invited them to try it on themselves, and for this they need to get up from their seats and take out their wands, which should help them collect magical energy. Likan was most of all, I'm glad about this, because finally they will be able to use magic. Garcia told them that while they were holding the energy, she wanted them all to imagine light in their heads. For some guys it was too difficult, no matter how hard they tried, but it was very difficult to imagine. Yenny actually had the idea in her head, that it felt like you were pulling on the reins of a wild, rushing horse. And if you lost concentration, even for a second, it would dissipate. Garcia at that moment continued to say that while they were concentrating on not letting the energy dissipate, she suggested that they cast a spell. The text of the spell contained only one word, light, but after Garcia said it, the entire lecture hall was literally seated. According to the teacher, the spell can be anything that comes to their mind, but she asked them to keep in mind that it is easier to pay attention to a short word. Lee Khan decided to structure this whole process a little in his head, and the first point was that he needed to collect magical energy, the second point was to turn it with his will, and the third point was to cast a spell. Having completed all these points, he succeeded, and his wand literally shone, but Lee Khan still believed that this was not enough. But the other guy's success was far from better. Some had sticks falling out of their hands, others had only some sparks instead of light. In general, Gainando's magical energy acts on its own and he could not control it. Therefore, Garcia decided to help him a little and extinguished his magic, which he no longer controlled. Then she added to him that if he loses control, then the magic can rebel and harm someone. But to prevent this from happening, she is there. So she allowed them to practice and not worry about anything. The second attempt for the guys was no more successful, because they never managed to do anything even close to what Garcia asked of them. Although the woman herself knew very well that the light spell is the simplest, mastering it usually takes more than a month of practice, so she was not surprised that they had no way to do it. But still, she believed that students should cope on their own, so she would not tell them about it. It came to the seventh attempt, where there was only one student left who was still at least somehow trying to do what was asked. And this student was Lee Khan, who raised his hand to ask if he needed to continue, because as you could see, the majority had already given up and he was left alone. Garcia was actually amazed that he was still standing and making his seventh attempt, because she knew very well that even if a first year has a lot of magical energy, they usually only last 5 attempts. In the East, some tribes call magical energy quite unusually. They call it ki. Scientists who like to show off call it ether, and some stubborn priests call it divine energy. This phenomenon, which goes by many names, is essentially the source of the magician's power. Since each time they cast a spell, it must be used. It goes without saying that young novice magicians are often faced with a lack of magical energy. However, Garcia could not tell that he looked tired, despite the fact that he was trying for the 7th time. So she asked him to tell him his name, and the guy introduced himself as Lihan, and the fact that he said the first name and not the family name gained the favor of the professor, who I saw a student not trying to stand out. Therefore, with a smile, she asked him to come forward so that she could examine Lee Khan in more detail. As soon as he was next to her, she immediately asked him to give him her hand, which he did without any problems. After which, Garcia's face changed, because she could not believe that she was seeing something like that. After touching his hand, her body seemed to plunge into a huge ocean. Lihan thought that something was wrong, so he called the professor to find out what happened. She told him that everything was fine and offered to return to class, although she couldn't even mentally imagine what it was all about. At this time, Gainando offered Yenny to save Lee Khan because it seemed to him that she could really eat him. She told him that everything was fine, but still asked him to come to her after class, to which he rather reluctantly agreed. After which she addressed everyone with the words that she was sure that they all felt how easily energy could run out. But still she asked them not to worry, because with practice the amount of energy would increase, and they would spend it all each time less and less. She decided that it was necessary to say once again that she does not eat people so that everyone would understand this, after which she notified everyone that the lecture was over for today, and they had all worked hard. After class, Lee Khan, as the professor asked, went into her office and he was immediately interested to know why she called only him. She told him that, to be honest, she heard about him even before the lecture from the director. This surprised the guy very much, because he didn't even think that that lich remembered him. She noticed that he was clearly starting to worry, and Garcia immediately decided to calm him down, saying that he really had nothing to worry about. She also told him that it may seem, of course, that the director has a little problems in his head, but in fact he is very kind. She told him that the students don't know this, but the director has a keen eye for people, and every year he tells the professors about new students. For example, last year he talked about beast people, who in his opinion are more capable than just burning down a dorm at one time, and also about a half-demon, next to whom you need to carefully use holy magic. But this year he talked about Lee Khan, about whom he said that the guy has the qualities of a huge fool. Garcia didn't understand what he was talking about, and why he called the guy a huge fool, because she didn't know how to understand it. But as it turned out later, in the East, there is an expression that what seems ignorance can be associated with wisdom. And in fact, he wanted to say that he saw in him the qualities thanks to which Likan would greatly succeed. Therefore, Garcia became interested in finding out what kind of student this was, and she had high expectations about Lihan. That's why she called him to her office. But on the other hand, she understood that she couldn't tell him all this. Therefore, she decided to say that she asked him to come in because she saw that he had too much magical energy for a first year. Likan, of course, was happy about this, but he still didn't understand why she called him for a personal conversation, because this could have been discussed in a lecture class. But then she still told him that he didn't just have a little more of her. He had so much of her that even she couldn't imagine where her limit ended. Now Likan understood why she called him straight into the office and didn't say it in front of everyone. The amount of magical energy is a decisive factor for a magician. If there is not enough of it, then one has to use intricate methods to draw out more, and the presence of a large amount of energy, in turn, frees one from such restrictions. In other words, this indicates great talent. Likan at that moment understood that if the professor was telling the truth, then a bright road to the future was prepared for him. But she suddenly stopped his joy and suddenly said that it was such a pity. Lihan didn't quite understand what she meant and why she suddenly felt sorry. Was it really a bad thing to have a lot of energy? Garcia, not particularly happy, replied that having a lot of energy is actually not bad, but the guy has too much of it, which worries her a little. Therefore, she decided to explain to him using the example of a glass of water. While the water is contained in the vessel, it is easier to control it. However, if he needs to control an entire sea, then it will be much more difficult. Lihan seems to have begun to understand that the complexity of controlling magical energy, which is the basis in his case, is at an unreasonably high level. While he was panicking, Garcia decided to put a bracelet on him, which she said would help with this. According to her, he absorbs magical energy and should help him a little. Likan realized that as long as the bracelet was on him, there should be no problems. But she immediately upset him again, because it would not be entirely logical to call him here if the problem was solved so simply. Garcia told him that the bracelet would help him if he used a lot of spells to drain his energy. And there was good news for him. She allowed him to practice on his own, since nothing would happen if his energy was depleted. But Lihan was not entirely happy with such an offer, but still thanked her. After he left her office, the only thought in his head was that now his future looks a little bleak, and from now on he needs to keep all his grades up. Therefore, he decided to ask his friends again if they had decided on any activities. Ina decided that she would attend a course in alchemy and invited them to go with her. Gainando immediately decided to say that alchemy is actually a servant's job, and he doesn't understand what is being taught at all, so it seemed to him that Ina was stupid. Likan immediately realized that the prince had said this in vain, because Yenna had already asked him to move away so that she could get closer to this smart guy. A few seconds later, she dealt him a precise blow right in the face, simultaneously telling him that he would never dare ask her for medicine again if he suddenly ended up in the hospital. Lihan knew a little about fighting thanks to Arlog's fencing lessons, and in his humble opinion, it was a 10 out of 10 blow that Gainando will remember for a long time. But still, he was not entirely sure that the prince could be beaten like that. But the girl assured him that in fact, everything was fine. She would only need to ask him for forgiveness the next day. Likan realized that it looked like this. This is not the first time this has happened. Suddenly they stopped, because they saw that in front of them, there were a lot of students from other towers, and especially from the Black Turtle. And it was not entirely clear what they were doing here. Likan, of course, actually didn't care at all, but their views worried him incredibly much. He knew that peasants usually have two ways to react to the appearance of a nobleman. They are either afraid because they do not want to get involved with him, or they demonstrate hostility, as for example they do towards Likan, whom they feared because of his last name. The guy himself was well aware of the fact that if he behaved too friendly, it could backfire on him. But suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a rather familiar voice, and it seemed it was the professor. For all the kids at the academy, after the Lich director and the half-troll professor, it wasn't strange to see another quirky professor. But this professor wasn't that special. He was just an ordinary old gnome. His name was Yurgulm Gomdar, but he allows his students to address him as Professor Yurgulm. He was sure that they all had the same thought. They have such a majestic academy. But for some reason they gathered in a clearing where there is not a single desk. Why is that? The princess raised her hand again and decided to say that they did this in order to feel the mana of nature and understand what forces existing in nature are important for the alchemist. Yurgulm looked at her with incomprehension because this was the wrong answer. Yenna and Lacan were talking at that time, and the guy said that he seemed to have an answer, but he wasn't completely sure of it. But still, he decided to say that perhaps this was an excellent place to collect materials, and this was the correct answer, which greatly pleased the professor. Yurgulm praised Lacan for his sharp mind and added that this would greatly help him in the future. Lacan at that moment was thinking that it would probably be better to miss the fact that he simply pointed his finger at the sky and guessed right. And mentally, he asked not to see me as a rival. Yurgulm interrupted his thoughts and asked each student to pay attention to him, because the real reason that they gathered here is that here, he can teach you the most important things about alchemy. He was also sure that they believed that alchemy required exceptional intelligence and the ability to control magic well. But in reality, this is far from reality, because in fact the most important skill for an alchemist is gathering resources. After this, the girl decided to point out the fact that resources can actually be created by yourself or ordered from others, so she believed that there was no point in saying that collecting resources was the most important thing. Hearing this, the other students noticed that in fact, Her Highness was right. Why should they extract resources at all? But this only angered Yurgulm more, who began to shout at her because he believed that she knew nothing at all about the real world. He believed that she couldn't even grow 10% of the resources she needed on her own. And the ones she orders will be unusable. So the reason they travel with adventurers is because they are stupid asses when it comes to digging up herbs. They will ruin valuable specimens. Therefore, he was now trying to explain to them that an alchemist must know how to independently obtain resources, and if they cannot do this, then they will never become great alchemists. After which he summed it up, saying that this explanation should be enough, and invited them to finally move on to practice, and each of them had a picture of the plant in front of their face that they would need to bring to him. It was strange for Lihan to read that it was a corrupted herb that was used in the creation of antidotes, so he decided to ask Yenna if she had ever worked with it. Around Einrogard, despite his prestige, there are a lot of unpleasant rumors, and one of the gossips says that while learning magic, people die. Of course, it was clear to Likan that magic was dangerous and incidents were inevitable, but it was a matter of insufficient preparation. He didn't understand why send students to such places, so they decided that he and Yenna needed a third person to go to that forest, and Likan offered to take Her Majesty with them, who apparently also became interested in alchemy. It seemed to Yen that that strict princess had a rather complex character, so she was not entirely sure that taking her with her was a good idea. But Lihan decided to remind her once again that they were just looking for herbs, that's all. But when they looked in her direction, they realized that apparently they were too late, because she had already gathered a team with which to go into the forest. But what confused Lihan the most was that there were people from the Black Tower who had successfully bypassed him. Yenna noticed that the princess was quite popular before entering the academy. Other members of the imperial family know her because of her intelligence and talent. She is everyone's favorite star, so everyone follows her, regardless of her title. But still, Likan noticed the fact that those who had already found a place in the teams left. Only the students from the Black Turtle Tower remained. And yet he understood that even if they hated him, it was still too dangerous to go together, so he believed that they needed someone capable to cover their weaknesses. Therefore, he turned his gaze to a rather unusual girl who seemed to be an elf. This girl's name was Nilya. She was from the Black Turtle Tower, because she herself was a dark elf and a member of the Shadow Watch of the Patrol Police of the northern part of the Empire. And the Shadow Watch is a group of experienced hunters and scouts who are located on the northern mountain range and know its territory as your 5 fingers. Therefore, it was quite obvious that it would not be difficult for her to find such a plant, although she honestly admitted that this was the first time she had heard about the desecrated grass. But it would not be difficult to find it. She was sure of it. In her mind, Nilya thought that the forest was like a playground for her, and she was actually surprised when she saw so many capable newcomers. But in any case, she believed that now it was her turn to prove herself. Suddenly her thoughts were interrupted by Yenna, who introduced herself, and Lihan, who were so glad to meet her. She immediately noticed the fact that Lihan did not say which house he was from, but she immediately wanted to know who they were and what they wanted from her. In response to this, Yenna immediately invited her to go to the mountains with them. Ninya ignored this proposal and wanted to find out what they really needed from her, because she knew very well that all nobles were the same. They insult everyone, calling them savages, and even if you show them kindness, they will complain about mistreatment, and therefore she saw no reason why these two should be different. Li Kan entered into this dialogue and tried to reassure her that they really came to invite her to go into the forest together, because he believed that walking there alone was quite dangerous, in case a monster appeared there. But she immediately told them that she didn't need their help, and therefore Li Kan would like to know why. Although, without waiting for her answer, he asked her if she really thought that they wanted to use her as bait or abandon her. The girl couldn't believe it. How did he even know about it? But still, she didn't show it, and simply told him that she wanted to go alone. But this alarmed Li Kan even more, because who normal would go into that forest alone? Therefore, he was sure that this was not the main reason, because she could not know what would happen in the forest. And besides, she needed to collect resources and bring them. And in the end, he added that he was sure that she was not stupid and understood perfectly well that she was unlikely to cope alone. All these words angered her even more, so at one point she finally shouted and asked him to stop, because she was ready to go with them, if only he would shut up. Li Kan was very happy that she agreed, but Yenna simply didn't understand what he was taught at home. Where did he get such manipulation skills? While Li Kan and Yenna were on the ground, Ninya did not miss the opportunity and jumped through the trees. And now Yenna was sure that she was an experienced hunter, and she would like to know how Li Han found out about this. The guy explained that he noticed the fact that her calf muscles are quite well developed, and she also has calluses on her palms because she often uses a bow. Such signs can only indicate that she is a hunter. Ninya perfectly heard everything the guy said, and she was also surprised that he understood who she was only after noticing these signs. She also noticed the fact that he had a strange aura floating around him, as if he was able to read minds. But then he suddenly said that he was just joking and added that he saw a shadow watch badge on her belt. Yenna suddenly interrupted him and asked Ninya to go with them and not drive them away. But she didn't understand why she should do this. Li Kan answered her that in fact only Yenna can distinguish between herbs. So if she falls from fatigue, the two of them will have to cope. But Ninya could not answer anything. But still, she asked Li Kan why they needed him because she can find grass and she is a guide and he is of no use. Li Kan understood that she was actually right. He was useless in this case, but this could not be said under any circumstances, so he decided to say that he was protecting them. She told him that she immediately noticed that he was well built and probably from the House of Knights. But then she did not understand why he lives in the Blue Tower. Li Kan answered her that he was not from the House of Knights, but from the House of Vardanaz. The guy believed that this was his best chance to get closer. But apparently he was wrong, because from the girl's reaction it was clear that she was too scared. The girl literally began to panic, because she didn't expect to hear that he was really from the Vardanaz house, which she was so afraid of, and now she didn't even know what to tell him. Li Han decided to clarify with Yen what was wrong with his house, and she noticed the fact that there were false rumors about all the houses of aristocrats, but his house seemed to her to be a special case. As far as the girl knew, they say about the guy's house that the patriarch of the house, Vardanaz, is a dragon who, during an incident with the maddened undead, burned them to the ground with his fiery breath. It was also known that the House of Vardanaz is connected by blood with ancient spirits, because of which the members of the house have incredible abilities, in return losing their emotions. So everyone believed that this house knows no pity, and the magicians of this house, who appeared to quell the unrest, wiped out the city faces of the earth. Li Kan had no idea that there were such legends about his house. That is, they have the image of those who, if something happens, will turn into monsters and sweep away everything in their path. But he still didn't understand why only his house was so special, because on the other hand, magicians should help people and not destroy them. And so Yenna asked him not to dwell on this and move on with his life. Looking at all this, Ninya realized that she certainly doesn't know what about the rest, but the gossip that they have no emotions is definitely false. Therefore, she still continued on her way with them, but only with one condition. She asked him to stop whining, otherwise he would go on alone, and Li Kan had no choice but to agree with this. After some time of walking through the forest, she suddenly stopped and jumped down to them, simultaneously asking them to stop as well, after which she asked them to pay attention to what was behind the bush. And there one could see quite large traces of some kind of animal, and even worse, a monster. Ninya also did not forget to add that since they are shallow, It seems to her that they were left by an animal that is able to control its strength in order to hide its tracks. But looking at her fellow travelers, she realized that they were actually not interested in this at all, although they were trying to pretend otherwise. And so she realized that she was getting carried away again and should unlearn it for now, because such things are only of interest to the villagers. So she told them that it was really not that important. But before she had time to say this, Likan approached her and asked if she could find out anything else by looking at these traces. It was so unexpected that the girl couldn't even say a word in response to it. She just couldn't believe the fact that he was really curious, so she asked him again. Lihan didn't quite understand why she was asking this if he had just asked her to do it. Ninya explained to him that he was from a big house, which is why she thought it was so strange. Then she added that when you come across such traces, it is best to be careful. After all, one could notice that this animal not only has large claws, but one can also predict what kind of creature lives here. But it is still very difficult, because as far as Ninya heard, quite a diverse fauna lives around the school. And she was right, because the territory of Einregard is really rich in magical energy, which affects the land, so different types of monsters converge here. Of course, Ninya did not forget to add that there are also monsters created during experiments and monsters that appeared from discarded elixirs, such as strangely shaped slugs. Lihan, listening to all this, could not help but notice that there were clearly big security problems here. But suddenly, Ninya suggested changing their plan, and instead she wanted to follow these tracks, so she believed that they would have less chance of being ambushed. Likan was not against such an idea, but he also wanted to ask her for something, namely that she would teach him to read the tracks. She immediately answered him that it was actually not as easy as it seemed to him, and most likely he would quickly give up. But he assured her that if she taught him, he would do his best to learn it. Although Ninya was against this idea, she still told him that he could try. After some time, as they walked through this forest, they still managed to find the very grass that the professor asked them to bring. Ina just thought that they were out of luck, because so far they had only been able to find 2 pieces, but she still believed that they could quickly find another one. She was also sure that there was definitely no one else nearby, so they should move on. But no one answered her, so she decided to turn around and ask them what happened and why they were ignoring her. And there she saw a not very pleasant picture. In front of them stood a huge boar, who clearly did not intend to show them where the secret grass was. Likan noticed that judging by the fact that he felt magical energy in it, this was not an ordinary boar. Ninya could have said without him that it was a monster, and they needed to come up with something urgently. The guy understood that this was too dangerous a situation for them, and so he began to take out his wand because, in fact, he didn't have any other weapon. He decided that this was the perfect moment to use his wand. But since Lihan was not yet very good at magic, he decided that in this situation it would be best if he changed the size of the wand, which was quite easy to do. Ninya immediately calmed down a little because she remembered that Likan was from the House of Magicians. And this is not to mention the fact that his house is the best in the Empire, so she was sure that he must have learned a couple of spells before entering the academy. But still, she decided to ask him again if he was confident in his actions, but the guy was not quite ready to give her an answer to this question. Ninya turned to him and said that if he was not sure of his actions, then he should take his red-haired girlfriend and run, and she, in turn, would take him away from them. Yenna and Lihan couldn't believe their ears that she was so worried about them, but she believed that only she could do something like that. Likan was very grateful to her, and asked her to take care of him if the situation suddenly got out of control. In the meantime, he decided to try to fight this monster, and Ninya was incredibly interested in finding out what spell Likan uses to defeat this boar. When Lihan was about 10 years old, he was told that the sword may be the king of all weapons, but he should not rely on it alone. He was taught that he must master different weapons in order to be ready for any situation. Only those who have achieved an understanding of the process can learn to pour mana into their weapons. This is called the aura mode. But his teacher then thought that when the boy grows up and learns the truth, he will be disappointed, because only a small number of gifted people can achieve this regime. And Likan himself didn't understand why he was trying so hard, because he wants to become a magician who will work in the office. But he told his teacher that he was sure that there was meaning in training, as it seemed to him that they would help protect himself in the future. Arglo could not believe that their young master was not at all like other nobles who chase unrealistic dreams, so he was ready to guide him to the very end so that he would learn aura. And the incredibly hard training now should have helped Likan cope with this monster. But he decided that a fight with this big guy was definitely not beneficial for him, so he decided to strike him with just one blow, but this blow was aimed directly at his mouth. After this blow, the girls even felt a little sorry for this boar, not to mention the fact that they were incredibly surprised by what Likan decided to do. But be that as it may, this blow was accurate, and after it the boar fell, and apparently this was the end of its attack. Einrogard's wand is very strong and can be used as a club, but you can't defeat the monster like that. But Likan still managed to do it, and all thanks to the fact that he used mana subconsciously, so he managed to overwhelm him. Ina couldn't understand why this lesson was so difficult. She was very tired during their hike, and a boar also attacked them. She just couldn't believe that the professor sent them to such a place, and they were still first years. But before she had time to finish speaking, they suddenly heard another roar, and it seemed like it was another boar rushing straight at them. They got closer and tried to follow this sound, and when they did this, they actually saw a boar there, which was trying to attack another group of students. There were many more people in this group than them, so they decided that they didn't need help. They definitely had to cope with so many people. Suddenly, one of them shouted that she would deal with this boar, and just like Likan, she enlarged her magic wand, and this girl's name was Asen. Yenna recognized this girl almost immediately. It was her friend Asen from the Dalkad house. This house is renowned for its excellent and precise workmanship. If, for example, the House of Vardanaz played the role of advisor to the emperor for many generations, then the House of Dalkad played the role of chancellor and treasurer. Lihan had also heard a lot about this house. He knew that they were loyal people, and judging by her stance, she had studied fencing for a long time. Asan herself was confident that she would cope without any problems, because it seemed to her that she could predict all the movements of this boar. After which she went into battle and tried to land a precise blow on his body. But apparently her calculations turned out to be wrong, because this boar only received a bruise after her blow, after which he struck her with both legs, from which he successfully flew off. The monster was not going to stop there, and continued to confidently attack other students. And if Her Highness had not come out in front of them, it was not entirely clear what the consequences would have been next. Yenna and Ninya were surprised that she stood up to protect the guys, and did not save herself. At that moment, the young princess only thought that her plan would work perfectly if she did everything as she planned. She believed that if she could calculate his movements and attack him at the time, then perhaps she would be able to strike him with an accurate blow. But apparently she was mistaken, because the boar was several times faster than she could have imagined. But before he had time to attack her, he suddenly fell unconscious, as if someone had dealt him a precise blow. Likan could only exhale because now they were incredibly lucky that the boar never noticed him. Ninya believed that this incident should teach him the importance of approaching from the leeward side, and he, in turn, hoped that she would continue to give him such useful advice. The princess, to put it bluntly, did not expect to see Likan Vardanaz here, but still she did not forget that she should thank him for his help. The guy immediately answered her that she didn't have to thank him, because in his place anyone would do the same. Ninya didn't understand only one thing. Why did they address each other so formally? Isn't familiarity supposed to be the norm between classmates? His Majesty promised Likan that she would definitely repay him. Then Likan decided to immediately ask her for a favor, since she wanted to thank him so much. She did not expect such a turn of events, and did not even guess what he would need from her, but still allowed him to speak. Likan's request was that he asked her to recommend him a subject where it would be easy to get good grades, and he asked her for this not in vain, because he knew very well that she had many connections in the academy. The girl did not expect such a request, and at first did not know how to answer this question. She literally did not understand what he wanted to say by this. She was also confused by the fact that a member of the Vardanaz house was interested in the activity for the sake of grades. Was he really testing her? Suddenly they heard some outside voice that turned to Likan and told him that he knew what item could be ideal for the guy. As soon as he heard this voice, he immediately had a bad feeling. It was a trembling in his body that was so familiar to him, and the atmosphere itself was heating him up. An alchemy teacher suddenly appeared behind him, who frightened him incredibly, and at the same time reminded him that this was an alchemy class. And in the guy's head there were only thoughts that it was as if he had met his professor from a past life. But then he immediately asked himself to calm down and come to his senses, because there was no reason to be so nervous. In addition, he himself has quite a lot of life experience, and he is no longer the immature student he was then. Therefore, he gathered his strength and answered the professor that his occupation seemed good to him if he had enough enthusiasm and dedication. But in response, he received only a malicious answer from the professor, who promised him that the guy would have both enthusiasm and passion. But with this, the professor ended his speech. and with it the lesson itself, so Likan could finally exhale calmly. Although he still did not forget to add that he was sorry that other groups did not meet these guys, Asen could not believe that he sent them to them on purpose. The professor did not understand this question. Did they really think that he only sent them to pluck the grass? According to him, the purpose of the activity was to allow them to encounter different situations while they search for herbs. And it really didn't matter whether they caught the boar, avoided it, ran away or hid. The alchemist must be able to cope with such unexpected circumstances. Ina was a little upset that they didn't need that desecrated grass, because they actually went through a lot to find her, and the three of them did it together, all together. The professor's face immediately changed. He could not believe his eyes that they had actually managed to find this flower, after which he ran up to them and assured them that they had actually pulled out the golden ticket, and it also seemed to him that they had a talent for alchemy. And as soon as the opportunity presented itself, he whispered in Likan's ear that, as he had said, the guy should attend his classes. The guy didn't want to upset the professor, so he told him that he would try to attend all classes because, as it turned out, he had always dreamed of doing alchemy, although mentally he simply resigned himself to reality. The man himself, looking at this guy, still saw something mature in him, because children at his age are usually rebellious, but this guy is completely different. So he told him that since he had defeated the boar and found the corrupted grass, he decided to give him a special privilege. The man began to tell him that he had a hut near the forest, and he allowed him to come there this semester whenever the guy wanted. Likan didn't quite understand why he came to this hut and what kind of work this old man wanted to load him with. Looking at the expression on Likan's face, the professor realized that he probably should explain himself, because some guys might misunderstand him. And for this, he decided to first ask them what they think the first-year students want most. To which they immediately answered that everyone only wanted food, and the man agreed with them, and he also added that because of this, the students looked a little gloomy, and within a week, he assured them that riots would begin. Likan completely agreed with him because no one could survive on such food for a long time. Besides, only nobles live in his tower, and in this regard it is even worse, because none of them are used to starving. And the man was telling all this for a reason, because as it turned out a little later, this hut is full of fresh ingredients for cooking, as well as spices and vegetables that he personally chose. For Likan at that moment, this meant the same thing as a free pass to an unlimited buffet. Therefore, the guy even wanted to shake his hand and say that the man was the best professor in this academy, and the man could not help but praise the guy in response. But most of the guys didn't think so, because at least he sent a boar at them, and therefore they will never return to this activity again, because next time they might die. Although Likan didn't think so, because in fact, it was not as surprising for him as for the others. So for him now, in fact, the main thing was to get food, which is what he and his new team were doing. The guy, of course, knew how to prepare meat for consumption, because his master taught him in childhood. But it would obviously be difficult for him to cope with this boar alone, and he understood this perfectly well. Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by Yenna, who offered him her help, if he didn't mind, of course. Likan thought that she didn't look well, so he decided to ask her again if she could cope, to which the girl confidently answered him that of course she would do it, if, of course, he then shared food with her. Ninya could not believe that they, as nobles, were going to cut up this boar, because it seemed to her that they would not be able to do it. In response to this, Likan invited her to do the division together, then she would receive her share of the meat from this boar. Without thinking for a long time, she agreed to this, and immediately invited them to show what the huntress was capable of. As it turned out later, Nilya is a professional in this matter, and Yenna came from a home where they know how to handle various materials, with which Likan was incredibly lucky. In addition, the professor was not against providing them with his tools, with which they could cut up the body of the boar, for which Likan was incredibly grateful to him. After a few seconds, they laid a blanket and closed the eyes of this animal, and also took the tools in their hands and were ready to start cutting up. Nilya, looking at Likan, thought that he was actually better, she thought. Apparently in Vardanaz's house they taught him similar things. Likan decided to tell them that after skinning they would cut the meat into pieces, then hang them on branches, and with the help of the intestines, they would make sausages. The guy was mentally thinking that he didn't know how long this damn life would last, so he decided that he needed to take care of long-term supplies. Therefore, they were able to make quite a lot of different preparations, and the professor was even impressed by the fact that the guy decided to process it all with smoke, which most first-year students do not do. In addition, he believed that this was very important, because no matter what the weather, the meat can easily spoil. So smoke treatment is just a great solution. Mentally, the man could not believe that the guy could go so far, although he had only been at school for 3 days and worked with meat like a real professional. So the professor never ceased to be surprised by him. His thoughts were interrupted by Likan, who was interested to know if the man was hungry, to which he received a small answer. The guy decided to make a small exchange, and therefore asked the man for butter and bread, and they gave him meat in return, which the professor simply could not disagree with. A few minutes later, the table was set and there was a sea of delicious food on it, which each of them missed. There was even jam, which Professor Yorgulma brought as a bonus. Ina decided to be the first to try this jam, and after a few seconds, she simply could not leave it. It was too tasty, which was quite pleasant for the man to hear. Well-cooked meat, sweet jam, rich, buttered bread, a peaceful, calm river, new friends. This is how Lekin's 3rd day at the Magic Academy passed. After they ate, even after processing with smoke, they were left with a lot of unprocessed meat, and they did not fully know what to do with it. A solution to this problem was suggested to them by Nilya, who said that perhaps they should share this meat with other guys at the academy. Likan immediately thought that he could sell them this meat, and it was just a great idea, although this was not what Nilya proposed. The guy immediately began to say that most students from the Blue Tower have a lot of money, and this will not be a problem for them. Likan's motto was, "Plow like a horse to live in abundance," and Yena's motto was, "Save every coin for the workshop," so they are different from the others, but both are incredibly similar to each other. Nilya couldn't fully understand this, and simply didn't fully believe that they really wanted to sell everything. They didn't understand why she was so surprised by this, and suggested that she do the same, but she's not like them, and so she immediately made it clear that she would give it away to her friends just like that. Likan believed that this was only her business, but it still seemed to him that she would later regret it, and Yena completely agreed with him. Friendship is actually temporary, but coins are eternal. At this time, she began to think that they had both talent and passion, but they looked like those who should expect trouble. The overdimensional Blue Dragon Tower is located away from the main building and always welcomes students with the scent of fresh leaves. But today was different. After all, Likan and Yena decided to have a picnic, although it was not entirely free. The guys had not eaten anything meat for too long, so it was clear from them that they were very hungry and would not mind having a snack. Likan asked them to come in and sit down, because they had prepared it especially for them, so they shouldn't be shy and stand still. The guys couldn't believe their luck. They were literally drooling when they saw the fried meat. But before they were about to sit down, Likan warned them that first they must each give a silver coin. It was too meager for them. They didn't even think before giving the money, because in fact they couldn't even remember how much time had passed since they ate meat. It literally, immediately dissolved in their mouth, and some of them, they couldn't even believe that they shared something so precious with them. Lihan did not even expect that their business would go so well, because according to his calculations, they earned 3 times more than it would have cost outside the academy. But on the other hand, they didn't even feel sorry, because they understood that it was almost impossible to get meat in these parts. So this was a pretty fair price, as it seemed to them. Gainando just woke up. He probably slept for more than a day, but all this screaming woke him up, so he still went out to see what was happening. His thoughts were filled with food. It even seemed to him that he would soon die from hunger strike. And then he saw beautiful pieces of meat that seemed to be waiting for him. Likan interrupted his stupor and suggested that he go get something to eat, because he was probably hungry. The guy couldn't believe his luck that he could eat it too. There was no need to ask him for a long time, so he immediately sat down at the table and was about to bring the first piece of fried meat to his mouth. But he was stopped quite in time by Likan, who had previously demanded from him 1 silver coin for a piece of meat. Gainando did not expect that they would take money for it, although Lihan thought that he knew that the pride of the nobles is not to take something for free. But unfortunately, Gainando did not have any money at all, and this is due to the director, who unfortunately threw it away all his wealth. Likan didn't want to leave the guy without a piece of meat, so he invited him to sign a loan agreement, which obliges him to pay back the money later, but with a small additional payment. Gainando, without even thinking, wrote his name into this agreement and then burst into tears with happiness that he had such a wonderful friend as Likan, who would finally feed him. The guy was eating a piece of meat and thinking about how lucky he was to make friends with such a wonderful person. Now it seemed to him that he had a great understanding of people. It seemed to him until the end that he had finally found real friends who cared about him. It was a happy day for everyone in the area. The next day, they were scheduled to study basic magical symbols, but this activity seemed so useless to most because they believed that the nobles did not need such classes. They were already very smart and educated in this regard. Li Han, listening to all this, didn't even think that people could lie to themselves so sincerely. When suddenly their conversations and thoughts were interrupted by the fact that the study room was closed and then filled with green light, which was accompanied by a very familiar voice that wished all the students good morning. Li Han couldn't believe his ears. He really didn't want this voice to be what he was thinking about. But unfortunately, his worst fears came true. The director was the professor of magical symbols. The first thing the director began to say was that he saw how well they ate, although it seemed to him that they would need much more time to get food. One of the students suddenly asked him a question. Did he really think that they had to look for her themselves? The director made it clear to this guy with just one look that he said something wrong, and was glad that they were learning quite quickly and no longer asking him stupid questions. The Lich knew one thing, that newcomers come every year. But what remains constant is that the newcomers from the Blue Dragon Tower always remain the weakest and slowest. The fastest is usually the Black Turtle Tower, followed by the White Tiger Tower. Compared to them, the Blue Dragon Tower, which is full of high-ranking nobles who have never done anything difficult in their lives, has adapted the longest, but be that as it may, the guys adapted perfectly. But the director was not so stupid, and he understood perfectly well that at the head of this phenomenal device was no one other than Li Han. The guy already very much regretted that he met the eyes of the directors, and the Lich himself at that moment thought that he was right when he thought that the guy was different from the others. Who could have known that someone so free would end up in this harsh faculty? The director was convinced that freedom is the most important thing a magician should have, and therefore puts his students in extreme situations. And besides, it was quite entertaining for him to watch. When suddenly all his thoughts were interrupted by another student, who decided to ask the director why this lesson was needed. Leech noticed that this was a pretty good question and decided to ask the guy what he thought it was for, but the student was not sure of his answer. Therefore, the director had to tell him that the fact is that when graduates cause trouble outside the academy, the damn emperor blames the director of this academy. According to him, they don't even imagine how many problems their senior comrades are causing. And this lecture on studying the symbol will be his excuse when the envoy comes to talk about the assholes of the high school students. He won't be able to punish him for their deeds. The director really hoped that the student understood him and would now know why he needed this lecture. After which he added that magicians are unpredictable and asked them to talk about how they are different, because this would only infuriate him even more. He ordered them to immediately open their textbooks to the first page and forced them to start reading everything that was written there. They, like a flock of sheep, began to repeat everything that was written there, that they, as magicians, would never in their lives harm civilians using their magic. But this was too little for the director, so he ordered them to read it much louder so that other audiences could hear it. Li Han, doing all this, was not particularly happy because he was not entirely sure that it could even work. The director could only hope that today's lecture had stuck in their kind hearts, but in any case it was time to start, and for this he would need 2 assistants. Li Han, looking at his colleagues, noticed that each of them was looking away, and he knew perfectly well that the task would be difficult. The director immediately told them that if suddenly there were no volunteers, it would be even worse for them. After these words, Li Han stood up from his seat and decided that he agreed to be an assistant, because mentally he was sure that he would get credit for it somewhere. The director immediately came right up to him and asked the guy if he really liked standing out among people so much. Li Han decided to say that he was honored to help the professor whom he respected so much. The way the guy threw around empty compliments infuriated the director. But still, he added that opportunity comes only to those who are ready to take advantage of it. Now, Li Han was sure that the director guessed that the guy volunteered only for profit. When suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by Gainando, who decided to check with Li Han whether he had gone crazy, because the prince believed that no one knew what this madman could do to him. But his words were suddenly interrupted by another guy, who literally forbade Gainando to stop Li Han. Because he had not gone crazy, in his opinion, he sacrificed himself for them. This provoked Gainando to start thinking that he should also get up and help his friend at this difficult moment. But just as he was about to say that he also wanted to be a volunteer, suddenly one of the students had already asked to be the second assistant. It was Asan, who raised his hand right in front of the prince and decided to become the second assistant. The director immediately recognized this guy because he is the Ironhead from the Dalcad house, whose family is good at working with documents. In response, the guy could only thank him for the compliment. Likan didn't understand why Asan also did this. Is he really also pursuing a similar goal? But apparently the guy was wrong, because Asan turned to Likan, and in this way he wanted to repay him for his help in the forest. Likan immediately said that it was not worth going so far for this, but in response he only heard that his family always makes sure that everything is paid. Suddenly, their dialogue was interrupted by the director, who of course was pleased to see that they were getting along with each other, but he would like to get to work. Using magic, he created 2 copies of the safety rules and asked the guys to copy them for the next lecture. But not just 1 copy, but 1 for each student. Asan simply could not believe that he was doing such things. He was really angry with every word of this security protocol. But what irritated him most was the fact that the professor forced them to do this nonsense when they could have been doing magic. Likan, looking at this guy, only hoped that he would not die while writing all this, because the guy actually began to guess what the director was up to, and Likan was almost sure that he thought something like use magic, if writing all this by hand bothers you so much. But the problem was that they couldn't even use basic spells to create light, let alone writing magic. Therefore, Likan was sure that if the director had even an ounce of conscience, then he had left a clue for them somewhere. Asan noticed that Likan was not writing anything, and therefore decided to ask him what he was doing. Likan explained to him that he was looking for a clue to resolve the situation. Maybe he would find something useful for himself. It seemed to Asan that this could not be done, and it looked more like some kind of theft. Although the guy reminded him that there are no rules that prohibit doing this, besides, this is the director's lecture hall. Asan liked Likan's way of thinking, so he still agreed with him, and added that sometimes you can actually steal for your own benefit. So he suggested splitting up and searching together. The 2 of them began to search the director's desk, but so far none of them had seen anything remarkable, but Likan was sure that there must definitely be something. Suddenly, Likan noticed a rather strange bedside table that glowed with a bright light. He immediately asked Asan to come here because he had found a bedside table from which strange magical energy was emanating. Without thinking for long, they decided to open it and see what was inside. And as soon as they did this, the director climbed out of this box and looked at them. But Likan immediately realized that this was not the real director. It was just an illusion spell that the director left as a hint for them. After which, the director's illusion began to say that the fact that they opened the box meant that they had already finished with the meaningless work and began to use the heads for their intended purpose. He himself hoped that this would happen sooner rather than so late, because the later they discovered it, the worse they would look, having wasted so much time. After which he finally talked about the spell itself, which, according to him, belonged to the first circle, low-level manipulation, and he could advise them to learn it as soon as possible. At this point, his speech ended and he simply disappeared, leaving the guys alone with their guesses. Asan became even angrier because he didn't fully understand why the director decided to teach them a lesson in this way. Therefore, he suggested filing a complaint against him together, because it seemed to him that if they acted together, then even the director would not be able to do anything to them. But Likan didn't seem to listen to him. He read too carefully what the director left for them in that nightstand. After which he suddenly became distracted and immediately told his friend that he could not help him with anything, because it seemed to him that complaints would not work against the insane director. And Asan actually understood this himself, because these were Einregard's rules. Likan suggested that he better practice magic because they had everything they needed, and the ingredients of a good spell included will, gestures, and also a good spell for using low-level manipulation, which they began to do. But so far nothing has worked out for them, and the result they expected did not come to them. After some time and several dozen attempts, Asan ran out of mana and Likan suggested giving him a break. The guy himself understood perfectly well that magic is not a simple thing. It looked like light movements to him, but everyone collects energy differently. At moments it even seemed to him that he was like a clown performing in front of a bunch of people. But now is not the time for this, and he decided to convince himself that now he needed to concentrate and imagine that this was his last chance, as if there was a minute left before completing the task. He repeated in his head, straight as a serene bamboo tree but soft as a feather. Gathering all the strength and energy he controlled, he once again ordered the feather to move. And what a surprise it was when Likan managed to do it, and the feather was in the air at one moment. But this was still not enough, And Lee Kun understood this very well, so he decided that he needed to immediately force the pen to move towards the paper. Although as soon as he moved his hand, the feather shot out of the window like a bullet and broke it. Most likely, he expected to see not such a result. Therefore, he decided to reread the paper on which this spell was described, and after a few minutes, he could notice that there were two difficult points in it. The first of them occurs when, after casting a spell, you need to continue to concentrate and control the object without stopping. But at this stage, he was able to finish the most difficult part of the spell, and now control should be easier. So he decided to try again, but this time with more control. Lee Kun tried to do everything as slowly and unhurriedly as possible, when suddenly the office doors began to open, and it was the director who came in and immediately began to say that if they wrote the norm, then they could be free, because then he would do everything himself, with the help of his magic. With this cry, he knocked down all the guy's concentration, and it turned out that this feather flew away again at the speed of a bullet. But this time it didn't hit the window, but straight into the director's head. The guys understood that this was most likely the end of him, which came so quickly after entering the academy. But instead of being angry, the director said that he thought that it would take them more time to master this technique. But now he can safely admit that Lee Han is much better than the Ironheads. Lee Kun, of course, was pleased to hear this, but he was almost sure that it would definitely not end just like that. But it looked like the director was in a good mood. And so the guy finally decided to ask him how to become better at control. The director told him that in fact, this is a problem for many newbies, so there's really no need to worry. And Lee Kun was already thinking that it was all about magical energy, but fortunately, he was wrong. But then the director began to laugh, because this was another joke from him, because in fact, everyone has problems with the spell, and it is possible to control it after a couple of attempts. Although nevertheless, the Lich told him that he was the only one who launched the arrow, so he should try to figure out what was going on himself, and then he was sure that the guy would increase his magic. Lee Kun bowed his head in front of him and thanked him for all this, and somehow the director was no longer having any fun mocking him, because he was behaving too much like an adult. Therefore, he decided to switch to the guy who was with them, because his reaction was much more interesting. But still, he decided to tell them that magic is such that the more you use it, the better you master it, so there is essentially nothing to be afraid of. And now he asked them to go to dinner. And just as Lee Kun wanted to say goodbye to the director and go to the dining room, he suddenly realized that his body was already there. He couldn't just believe his eyes. Could this really be teleportation? Lee Kun landed on the ground and immediately thought about the fact that the director didn't even lift a finger to transfer them here, but still used the magic of movement. Although he later noticed that Asen was not next to him, as it turned out later, he was sent to the infirmary to restore energy. But what was most offensive was that there was absolutely no one in the dining room, because dinner time had already passed. The food was the same as always, but the guy was glad that he still had smoked meat from last time. But as soon as he sat down at the table to start eating, the princess approached him quite unexpectedly, who apparently had been looking for him for quite some time. He immediately stood up from his seat to ask her what she needed from him, after which she pulled out from behind her robe the list that the guy asked her to make. Lee Han was surprised that she didn't forget about it, but in any case, he was incredibly grateful to her for it. But when he looked at this scroll, he realized that this is not a list of subjects that are easy to get good grades in, but a list of popular subjects. Although this was not what he needed, he still read it to the end, and what surprised him most was the fact that alchemy remains one of the most popular activities. But still, he gathered his thoughts and told Her Majesty that apparently some mistake had occurred here, because he asked for a list of subjects in which it is easy to get good grades, and a list of popular subjects is fundamentally not what he needs. It was immediately clear from the girl's face that she didn't quite understand what the guy was telling her. Lee Han had to explain that a popular subject has the peculiarity that it is attended by many skilled students, so it is difficult to get good grades. But with unpopular subjects, everything is exactly the opposite. The competition is lower, and getting good grades is therefore much easier. She couldn't believe that he was really just looking for things where it would be much easier. After all, he is the son of the Vardanaz house, and this is so unlike them, because they have always been hardworking, and looking at the desires of this guy, I just want to say something else. In that forest, it seemed to her that he was more consistent with the title of nobleman, but it seems she was simply mistaken. But in any case, she pulled out a list of items from her pocket that were best avoided. And this is exactly what the guy needed, and now he began to feel the smell of unpopularity that he so needed. The first subject on this list was the basics of fencing. In this subject, it is rare to see a person who made all the way to the School of Magic to study fencing. In fact, the same thing could be said with studying the basics of magical combat using the method of interval repetition, because students who came to school in search of the truth are not interested in fighting. But since these items are not so popular, the guy decided that he needed to study them as best as possible, so he was very grateful to Her Highness. She, in turn, was slightly disappointed in him, and decided that it was time for her to leave. The next morning, Lee Kun went to his new subject with the thought that everyone refused to go with him. Ganando didn't immediately understand why he should choose an unpopular subject, because at least people from high society don't do that. Yena also did not support his idea because, as it turned out, she had already chosen the subjects she would take, and what Lee Kun offered her was in no way included in her plans. Asen didn't understand at all why waste time on such nonsense, because there were so many more useful activities that they could do. Lee Kun reacted to all this with a smile because he understood perfectly well that they had no idea what awaited them next. The guy knew that usually, regardless of the school, the teachers simply do not have the concept, because they know that the students have other subjects, but they sincerely do not care about it. Thus, in order to be able to concentrate on the subjects that students enjoy, he needs subjects where he can do nothing, so Lee Han believed that this would be ideal for him. But he was still confused by one thing. He did not understand why classes on the basics of magical combat were held in the basement, although the stairs looked quite normal. But Lee Kun was not completely left with a bad feeling. All residents of the Empire know that they should never thoughtlessly enter the Tower of Magicians, even if from the outside they look like ordinary people. But there were still stories when people got stuck in the tower forever after entering it once. Lee Kun had been reading such tales since childhood, and understood perfectly well that they were actually exaggerated, and his master completely agreed with him. The man actually did not expect anything else from fairy tales, because people who enter the tower never leave it. But in reality, everything is much worse. They simply die there. Lee Han was always not amused when he heard such words from his master. And since Einregard is the embodiment of a magical tower, even the most curious first years rarely explore the tower. But Lee Kun was sure that these were just fairy tales, because school remains school in the evening, so everything should be fine. In addition, he remembered that nothing happened to him on the first floor of the main building or in the dormitory, when suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by the director, who wanted to ask the guy if he had accidentally gone to the first floor. Obviously, the guy was a little scared when he saw the director, because he didn't expect to meet him here. But then, he seemed to be overwhelmed, and he thought that this was a great opportunity, and so he told the director that he was so glad to see him. After which he added that he was going to the first underground floor and would like to ask the director to share instructions with him. His instructions were quite expected, in fact. He told the guy that he would bring flowers to his coffin when they found his corpse. Lee Han actually didn't expect anything different, but it was still worth trying to talk to him. A few minutes later, Lee Han was already on this first floor, and in fact, although he was scared, everything was quite normal here. But on the other hand, he still had the feeling that something sinister was hiding behind the door. Suddenly, he noticed two students who, apparently, just like him, had signed up for this subject. It even seemed to him that there were many students here and he was not alone. This calmed him down a little. Suddenly, the guys read the sign for the basics of magical combat and realized that they had come to the wrong place and they needed to get out of here as quickly as possible. They decided that they needed to leave as soon as possible, and along the way, they began to discuss that it was unlikely that anyone had signed up for this subject at all, because people from all the towers were simply afraid to meddle here. And yet, when Lee Kun entered the class, he saw 3 people who apparently weren't afraid and signed up for this subject, which couldn't help but make him happy. Some guys immediately looked at Lee Kun and thought that he had wandered here completely by accident, although the guy heard all this and understood that he had come here on purpose. But then his attention focused on some strange ball. What is it for? Suddenly, all his thoughts were interrupted after he heard a strange voice coming from the corner of the room, and most likely it was the teacher. Lee Kun didn't even notice him, as did the other guys who were also in the class. As soon as the guy began to examine him more closely, he almost immediately noticed pale skin, a melancholic look, long fangs, and all this made him think that this man was a vampire. But guesses were quickly interrupted when this man introduced himself as Vagrek. He is a teacher of the basics of magical combat, using the method of interval repetition, and with a rather downcast face, he hoped for fruitful cooperation. After which he decided to move on directly to the topic of the lesson and began with the fact that on their desks there are balls made of heavenly spirit stone, which is very sensitive to magical energy. He also added that when the stars are in a certain position, they release holy energy, and the star spirit stone is able to absorb it. After such a short theoretical course, he immediately invited them to move on to practice, and first of all told them to stand up and pour magical energy into the balls in front of them, although it seemed to Li Kan that this would not work. And he actually had such thoughts for a reason, because he couldn't even cope with simple spells. But still he overcame himself and tried. Before they had time to touch, suddenly all these balls flew into the air in an instant. Li Kan understood that he had done nothing for this. Most likely the teacher was to blame for this, but still he could not believe that he could do it so simply. Although later the thought came to him that most likely it was not just a star spirit stone, but an entire artifact. And judging by the initials on these stones, the professor made them himself, which is why he is so capable of manipulating them. The idea immediately arose in his head that well-made artifacts could be sold at a decent price, and this already interested him more than this item as a whole. One of the students went a little overboard with the energy she put into this ball, and it literally flew out of her control, and it seemed like it was going to break through the ceiling. But the professor assured them that the shan is connected to their will, so they can control it, but he also placed a ban on destroying anything in the lecture hall. The girl noticed that this was an incredibly great idea, because any more, and there would have been trouble. She thought too much and forgot about controlling this ball, so she deservedly hit her in the head with it. Vagrek informed them too late that this ban did not apply to them, so they must be extremely careful. Then he decided to continue the lesson, and asked them to raise the ball into the air again. And every second Li Kan became more and more interesting in this lesson. And he liked the professor himself, because he was unlike anyone else. Vagrek at one point asked them to make this ball start spinning around itself, and Li Kan had problems with this, because even when controlling such an artifact, he has some problems and does not move as the guy wants. One of the students managed to do this at one point and the ball began to spin, but the professor remained just as cool-headed and therefore asked him to do it again so that he could see it clearly. Li Han didn't really want to do this all day, so he decided to ask the professor how long they would do this. Vagrek did not understand why this question was asked at all, if the answer is obvious that they will do this until they manage to do it perfectly. After that, some of the guys suddenly wanted to go to the restroom, so they asked the professor about it. But he immediately made it clear to them that there was no need to ask him about it, because here they are free people and do whatever they want. In fact, the guys obviously just wanted to leave as soon as possible, because they simply did not understand what kind of object this was and why they should spin this ball all day long. Before the guys had time to leave, suddenly the only girl who was with them suddenly lost consciousness and fell from loss of strength. Li Han could notice the fact that she was incredibly persistent in her work, and he was pleased to watch people like her. But still, he understood perfectly well that he should help her come to her senses, because she most likely lost consciousness for a reason, but because she simply ran out of internal energy. The girl could barely speak and then tried to say that she had simply run out of her mana and therefore she needed help. Li Kan actually understood this, even without her, although it was surprising to him that she did not pretend to escape from this lesson. So he took her arm and told the professor that she had lost consciousness due to the fact that she had exhausted her supply mana. Vagrek did not change his face at all, and could only say that it would be nice for her to continue drawing the circle when she recovered. After Li Kan helped the girl get to the first aid station, he returned to class and continued to practice. And he did this until he became interested in finding out how grades would be given in this lesson. So he decided to ask this question directly to the professor. For Vagrek, this was again a fairly obvious question, because grades will be given as required by the rules. The evaluation is carried out starting from the first place, regardless of how many students were present. Li Kan actually counted on this, because apparently no one else would take this class except him, and therefore this subject was just a jackpot for him. After all, it seemed to him that if he just held out until the end of the quarter, he could easily get the highest score for discipline. This is exactly the item that he was looking for. Now he just needs to repeat it and he will do it with joy. It was quite interesting for Vagrek to observe that Li Kan still had not gone anywhere. The fact was that every year students come to this subject like the tide, but they also disappear like the ebb. Last year, there was no one at all, but Vagrek didn't care about this at all, because according to the contract, he must teach the subject every year, and not collect those who want to attend it. In fact, every day he sat alone in the lecture hall and left when the class time was over. However, Now it seemed to him that an unusual freshman had appeared and disrupted the usual routine, an adult and handsome man who, judging by his habits and speech, came from a great house. Vagrek did not know about the amount of magical energy Likan had, but he easily noticed that he was special. Vagrek also hoped that Likan would continue to attend classes, because then he would finally be able to move on to the second lesson of this subject. After this lesson, in the restroom, Likan asked to listen to his friends, and he said in all seriousness that this subject simply could not be missed, because they could be guaranteed to get good grades in it, simply for being present. But it was clear from their faces that he did not convince them at all, because they were not entirely interested in this, although Gainando asked Likan what exactly they teach. The guy happily talked about how he needed to use his mana to lift the star spirit stone that the professor had prepared and practice drawing a circle with it. Gainando wanted to hear what would happen next, but Likan replied with a smile that that was all, because they didn't do anything else, which surprised the guys a little. They didn't quite understand what was so important here, but Likan immediately interrupted them and said that the main thing here was that he could get his grades, which he so badly needed. That's all he was interested in at the moment. Yenna would never have thought that Li Han was such an unusual guy who would only think about himself. She actually understood very well that it was not for her to say such a thing, but in her opinion, he was too much obsessed with profit. Likan wasn't too upset that they wouldn't go with him. Besides, it was time for him to run to the next subject. They were very curious to know what next subject he chose, and what was their surprise when he said that he would study the basics of fencing at the Academy of Magic. It seemed to them that this was an incredibly useless activity that could only be done at this academy. But Likan did not listen to them and went to the courtyard at the southern entrance to the main building, where there was a training ground where fencing was taught. And his guesses turned out to be correct when he entered the main gate and saw several guys there who apparently also came for this subject. Moreover, most of these guys were from the White Tiger Tower, which are mostly from the houses of knights, which means that they are good at swordsmanship and take it seriously. Therefore, Li Han thought that the basics of magical combat were handed to him on a silver platter, so he was not so upset that there were so many people in fencing, and besides, he had been steadily practicing fencing. But he stood out too much for the other guys, who almost immediately saw that he was from the Blue Dragon Tower. Moreover, they recognized this guy because they knew that he was from the House of Vardanaz, and apparently he came here because his mentor taught him fencing for the sake of general development. But they all thought that he underestimated fencing too much. Li Han immediately realized that they weren't treating him very friendly here, and he also heard that they were all too proud of their skills here, but he still didn't expect that he would encounter such hostility. But on the other hand, he understood perfectly well that this is actually not so important. After all, they are still just teenagers. Suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a huge troll, who rather unexpectedly came out of the gate. And he deliberately went to Likan in order to ask him if he was from Vardanaz's house by chance. Likan did not quite understand why he was saying this, but still did not hide the fact that he was from this house and, moreover, lived in the Blue Dragon Tower. After which, the orc began to say that it seemed to him that the guy was in the wrong place, because they were seriously engaged in fencing here, and not teaching beginners. Likan calmly thanked him for the information, but this angered the orc even more, who thought that the guy simply did not understand him, and therefore once again repeated to him that they were not just waving swords here, as aristocrats do. Then he added that he could be seriously injured in sparring, and no one here would give in to him just because he was a nobleman. Likan waved his hand in response to this, and said that he would try to restrain himself in the battle with the orc so as not to injure him. These words quite obviously hooked the orc, and so he began to boil like a kettle. And if the professor had not come out at that moment, then most likely he would have gotten into a fight, but the teacher called them to come to him in time. One could see surprise on Likan's face because he did not expect to see such a picture. The fact was that the fencing teacher was Professor Ingerdell, and what surprised the guy was that he was an elf, after which the elf added that he was sure that they had all already learned fencing here, and most likely came here to improve their skills, or not to lose the ones they had already developed. Therefore, he suggested that they immediately move on to practicing existing skills instead of learning from the very basics, and this was good news for Li Han, because he was really only interested in his grades from the very beginning. Suddenly all his thoughts were interrupted by some small elf from the White Tiger Tower, who came up, it seemed, just to say hello. Looking at this elf, Likan immediately thought that he looked like an elf who was popular with girls, but his thoughts were suddenly interrupted by the same guy who asked Likan, or is he from the house of Vardanaz? After Likan's answer, this elf added that he was actually just curious to know why someone from the famous house of magicians came to learn how to wield a sword. But for Likan, this was again very obvious, because he believed that few people would choose this activity, so it would be easier for him to earn good grades. Although in his mind, Lihan thought that if he told the truth, then this guy would hardly understand him correctly, so he decided that it would be easier for both of them if he pretended that he only cared about grades. This elf, as it turned out, is called Giselle and he is from the house of Murad, but he asked Likan to call him Murad. Likan immediately turned his attention to his hands, which were calloused, although it was worth noting that outwardly he looked like a sissy. But of course he didn't tell him that, but simply replied that he was pleased to meet you. Although on the other hand, Likan understood that there was nothing more to expect from his house, so he simply shook his hand. The Morads strictly adhere to the rules and protect the north. Being in harsh conditions, they are literally ready to resort to any means, methods, and tricks to achieve their goals. At least, that's what Lihan thought until he met Murad, who is completely different from them. But he remembered how people reacted to him and realized that rumors are actually not always true, so you shouldn't listen to them blindly. The art of the sword is a blue stone. It was taught to Likan by Arlog, and based on the name, one can guess that it is effective and easy to use. But the training was so difficult that the nobles did not really take up them. But Likan still managed to master them, because he believed that if you convince yourself that you can handle it, then it will be so, when suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by the master, because he became interested in knowing whether Likan uses the art of the blue stone. The professor immediately noticed that he had a well-developed background, and therefore began to think that most likely the guy was from some house where fencing was valued. But his face immediately changed to surprise after he heard that the guy was from Vardanaz's house. The master simply could not believe it, because the guy was able to master the basics, even being in a house where magic is more valued. Therefore, he first decided to clarify with the guy himself why he decided to study fencing, to which he received an answer from Likan that he was convinced that this was a vital skill for an aristocrat. But it was impossible to say from the master's face that he believed him. But in any case, Likan understood that the most important thing now is grades, and if he says something wrong now, then most likely he can say goodbye to good grades. Likan decided to say something that would raise him in the eyes of the teacher, so he said that he thought so before. But as he progressed in his study, he realized that he could not help but come here. From the expression on the master's face, it immediately became clear that he liked this answer quite a lot, because he changed his face and showed a characteristic hand gesture. But then the professor still asked the guy for forgiveness and added that he actually accidentally voiced what he was thinking. Looking at Lihan, he now understood that with his background in magic, he would make a serious swordsman, because he takes fencing more seriously than the students from the Tiger Tower. Therefore, the man could not help but say that thanks to Likan, he understood something, and that was that he would also be as serious as possible with him. After which he asked the guy to immediately take out his wooden sword, and they would begin the lesson immediately. But Likan did not expect this, and it seemed to him that this should not be the case. After some time, Likan was completely beaten and lying on the ground. Apparently they took him too seriously. The master, who was probably his opponent, stood over him and told the guy that the art of blue stone is like a boulder, and he thought so because his strong point is that he will not waver, no matter what happens. The master only asked him not to forget about it, but for today he suggested finishing the lesson, and from Likan's state it was clear that he didn't mind. For Likan, today the lesson was completed, and he could go to rest. Although in his mind he was thinking about how much his body hurt, it seemed to him that he had been hit more than 1,000 times in every point of his body. It was only worth noting how the master took advantage of his weak points and gaps in defense, which is probably why Likan was there until the end of the battle. Although Likan realized that the professor was taking him too seriously, because in the future it would be the White Tiger guys who would become real knights, but he treated them much easier than he treated Likan. If Arlog is like an unshakable stone, then Ingerdel is like a stream of water, despite his prosthetic arms and legs. And while Lena was thinking about this, Ingerdel was telling his subordinates that if they use the cloud art, then they need to alternate hands more, because the difficulty of two swords is that they are difficult to master, so he asked them to be more thoughtful when they use them. What about the art of the top of the moon? He could say that it is a fast and sharp art in which one must use the body to strike. Li-Han really enjoyed watching how this professor treated each student, because not only does he know absolutely every martial art, but he also gives each student personal advice. But even in this case, Li-Han could not understand why he could not leave the feeling that he had been beaten more than anyone. When suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by Ingerdel, who rather unexpectedly asked Li-Han to come to him. The guy was worried that the teacher called him to him, but he was not the only one who was called by the elf, because the second person was Durju from Choi's house. And this second person was precisely the ogre with whom Li-Han did not get along from the very beginning. But the most interesting thing was ahead, because as soon as they approached the teacher, he told them that they would now have a duel. The other guys didn't understand why they were the ones, and in general it seemed to them that this fight would not be entirely fair. But Durgu liked this idea incredibly much, so he did not argue with the professor. The master liked that none of them resisted, so he gave each of them a wooden sword with which they would fight. Li-Han at that moment understood perfectly well that his enemy was most likely waiting for this moment most of all, but now the guy has no intention of retreating. Moreover, as a child, he could have spent his time playing, but instead he learned to fence and got bruises, but never gave up. And he did all this just for moments like these, to stand on equal terms in a fencing duel. Ingerdel actually chose them because they seemed to him the most capable. Every experienced knight knew that it was impossible to master the art of the sword through theory alone. Only by practicing hundreds of times and conducting real battles can one see the path of the sword. For example, if a knight has learned to reach his opponent's neck, but he doesn't know how to do anything else, then it will not be so easy to reach his opponent. Knights use theory only as a basis, and understanding and applied skills as a supporting factor, to extract the absolute power of sword art. And according to the professor, these two are not only able to reach this stage, but also put faint traces of magic into the swords, which means that they are especially gifted as knights. Therefore, today they will be able to prove it, and the master asked them to take their places and begin the duel. Looking at Li-Han, the teacher thought that he had a good level of swordsmanship, no matter what house he came from. In addition, he was almost sure that the guy had experienced enormous pressure from his home since childhood, but he was very serious about this. Therefore, it seemed to him that Li-Han was a very capable student, whom he would lead along the path of the sword, no matter what the cost, and then gave the order to start the battle. In fact, he is expecting a lot from this fight, because he thinks that they are both pretty good with a sword, so the fight should be quite interesting. Choi House's Moontop art is fast and furious, as opposed to Li-Han's who uses bluestone art, which is strong and thorough. Ingerdel thought that since they were absolute opposites, they would have something to learn from each other. He believed that this was what opponents were for. The orc decided that since Li-Han was standing and not attacking, he would do it first. The guy barely managed to dodge this blow, which flew incredibly close to his face. In response to this, Li-Han decided to act a little dishonestly and threw sand at the orc, which blinded him for a while. Other students tried to tell the professor that this was dishonest, but the man was shocked by such an act. In his opinion, Li-Han was using everything she could, and that was right. Because in his head, first of all, it was a fight for life, and it didn't matter how to defeat the enemy. And in his opinion, Li-Han understands the meaning of these words with precision, so he has nothing to say to him. But Ingerdel also understood other students who saw this as foul play, and therefore believed that they simply needed more time to understand this. And all because they were born in houses where honor is respected, so perhaps they will never be able to learn such things. Moreover, he is able to ignore the words of other people in order to win. This is why the teacher likes Li-Han, because only a true swordsman does this. At that moment, the orc only thought that Li-Han had acted incredibly low, but on the other hand, it helped him weaken his defense. Li-Han, at this time, was not going to stop there and continued to attack, because he was sure that the orc still could not think clearly, and would most likely miss the blow again. Therefore, without thinking for a long time, he continued to advance, and it could not be said that his actions were unsuccessful. Li-Han actually didn't waste time while he sat and rested from the battle. He carefully watched his opponent, and when he saw his movements, he immediately realized that the orc was a pretty capable guy who should not be underestimated. But this still won't help him. At least that's what Li-Han himself thought, who did everything to create a scenario thanks to which he could win this battle. At some point, this began to bother Durgu, and since his opponent had gone so far, he decided to answer him in kind. Therefore, he decided to pretend that Li-Han hit him incredibly hard with his sword, and because of this, he was injured. The guy didn't understand how it happened at all. It seemed to him that he didn't hit the orc at all. So why did he suddenly end up on the ground? Durgu lay and thought only that there was no need to think about how he looked now. The main thing was to win this battle. The teacher liked all this incredibly much, so he clapped his hands until his students behind him did not understand at all what was happening. This turned out to be too humiliating for Durgu, so he decided that he would do everything to take revenge on Lihan, so he went on the attack again. He dealt blow after blow, but the guy skillfully dodged all the blows he saw. The fight was really interesting, even better than Ingerdell expected, because the guys are really very capable. Although he still did not expect that Durgu would demonstrate mastery of the art of the top of the moon at such a high level. But on the other hand, the teacher perfectly understood that the stronger and faster the blows, the more he spends stamina. But does Durgu understand this? Looking at Li Khan, one could only say that, on the contrary, he remained calm and only responded to the enemy's attacks. And the guy was focused on the fight for a reason, because he understood that his opponent's blows were quite strong and missing. Even one would be critical for him. But even this was not the biggest problem for him, because he simply did not understand what kind of pressure that was coming from Durgu. Chaos was happening in him until he forced himself to collect his thoughts and not concentrate, because he understood perfectly well that he should not show his emotions, because he could still take advantage of the opportunity and win. In addition, it was noticeable how the orc was bad at making decisions, since he did not expect such a turn of events, and this led to the fact that he made too many unnecessary movements, which in his opinion should have helped him. Moreover, judging by the mana in his sword, it is obvious that he is approaching the limit of his physical abilities. Li Khan, in turn, does not get tired at all using a small amount of mana. Therefore, in his opinion, the guy's victory is only a matter of time, but by this point, you still need to hold out, because blocking every attack of this guy is not so easy. Durgu at that moment simply could not understand what was happening and why he could not defeat this guy. Was he really not putting in enough strength? And looking at Li Khan, he didn't understand at all why the guy didn't get tired, and it felt like he just didn't show his emotions. It seemed to the orc that all his actions were as if he was trying to split a mountain with a needle, and all his actions only lead to the fact that it all benefits only Li Khan. Although at one point Li Khan still managed to make several good counterattacks, the result of which was that he literally knocked the sword out of the orc's hands, after which it didn't take him much time to put the sword in front of the orc's face and end this fight. At the same moment, Ingerdell appeared, who was happy to announce that the duel was officially over. Ingerdell at that moment thought that Durgu needed to be a little calmer, and everything could have been completely different, but he collapsed under the weight of the pressure of his opponent. Given his young age, this must have been difficult to bear because mentally he wanted to win incredibly badly. Li Khan at this moment radiates the energy characteristic of a high-ranking aristocrat. But the master could not help but tell them that they both had a truly excellent fight, and he also believed that the victory was not 100%. And he says all this only so that the winner remains humble, and the loser does not stop persisting for the sake of his further growth. And now, in his opinion, the most important moment has come, when they should shake hands and disperse peacefully. Li Khan, looking into the eyes of his opponent, understood perfectly well that, judging by his character, he would not remain silent, and if he did something wrong, the guy was immediately ready to answer him. But Durgu decided not to do that. On the contrary, he extended his hand and said that it was a good fight, and he also did not forget to ask for forgiveness for being rude to him then. After which he added that Li Khan is actually more than competent to attend these classes, which the guy simply did not expect. Although there was a thought in his head that the ogre could thus dull his attention in order to attack, but apparently this is not the case. Therefore, in response, he also decided to shake his hand and say that Durgu was probably just worried at that moment, so he said too much. In the evening after this lesson, Durgi was returning to his room when suddenly he was surrounded by students who most likely wanted to talk to him about something. But these were only pawns of the one who actually wanted to talk to him. The same elf who approached Li Khan wanted to ask the ogre if he planned to leave everything as it was after such humiliation. Durgu didn't understand what this conversation was all about, because he lost because he simply didn't have enough abilities. But everyone around him began to prove to him that Li Khan simply threw sand at him and generally fought dishonestly, which is why he lost. But in fact, he was not at all to blame. The elf who stood behind everyone suddenly began to say that in fact, in this situation, something completely different is important, namely, that the honor and pride of their tower was trampled on because of him. and therefore he believed that Dugru should suffer his well-deserved punishment for this. The ogre understood perfectly well that the Morad house ruled everything among the knightly houses, so this situation bothered him a little. Morad added that the punishment would actually be simple. The little elf believed that if Durgu could not defeat him personally, then he would need to do it with numbers. It seemed to the ogre that the knights should be ashamed to even think about this, let alone act like this. Morad believed that he was wrong, and only losers said such stupidity. Some guys who were also there did not understand why they were doing this, because it seemed to them that it was too much. Morad was annoyed by the fact that they were all talking behind his back, so he invited everyone who was not happy with something to tell him about it personally. But in response to these words, all they did was fall silent. Only Dugri found the courage to say that he is against such things, so he is not going to take revenge on anyone, especially in this way. For some reason, this amused Morad, after which he called the guy a coward and told him that he would apparently have to find a replacement for him. And looking at the crowd of people who stood next to them, it became clear that many were not against doing this instead of the ogre. At that moment, Dugru thought that Likan is certainly a capable guy, but it is very dangerous to fight alone against three, not to mention the fact that they are members of the houses of knights who train every day. Therefore, he decided that he could not simply close his eyes to this, because this is not how a knight should behave, and it does not matter what consequences his actions would entail. And he decided that the best decision in this situation would be to take Likan's side, and for this he immediately went to help him. But as soon as he reached his destination, he realized that Likan was apparently capable of handling everything on his own, because at least he was able to put one of them to bed. And he did it for a reason, but with the help of magic, which he already mastered much better than all of them combined. Some time ago in the forest, several guys from the White Tiger Tower finally waited for Likan, to whom they wanted to explain that he could not even think about the fact that they would just let that situation go, as he ruined a fair duel, and they were going to make sure that he no longer will be able to take this subject. Likan at that moment was not sure that the reason really was what happened in the duel. But in any case, something needs to be done. And therefore, to begin with, he decided to scare them a little. So he turned around and asked them just one question. Are they really so stupid that they do this, knowing what kind of family he comes from? This angered them even more, because it seemed to them that it was quite mean to try to intimidate them with this. But they immediately told him that they were not going to retreat for this reason alone. Likan just wanted to look at their reaction, and judging by it, these guys have something that they incredibly strongly believe in, or someone who is imposing this belief on them. It immediately seemed to him that someone was behind them, and they believed that if they did something, they would still be taken care of. But with all this, he just wanted to say that if they had at least half of their brain, they would not have gotten involved in something like this to begin with. Therefore, he decided to ask them directly who sent them. Is this some kind of great house? Why is it difficult to ignore the order? One of them immediately started shouting at Likan and asked him to shut his mouth for now, after which they decided to surround him and thus prevent him from escaping. Likan himself understood perfectly well that no matter how stupid they were, 3 against 1 is still too dishonest. At that moment, he remembered the words of his teacher who told him to run away if something like this happened. But the problem was that the path to retreat was closed, and now he didn't even know what to do. Although then he looked below him and discovered a small number of small stones that he thought he could use. He thought so because their size was almost that of a feather, with which he did a great job. Full of confidence, he lifted these stones into the air and ordered them to move, after which he directed them at the guys who wanted to teach him a lesson, and they, in turn, now began to understand why the Vardana's house is different from other people. Likan was so glad that it worked. It seemed to him that this would be enough to scare them, but he also knew very well that he did not need to slow down to get out of here, after which he struck one of them on the head with a small stone, and said that if they did not get out of the way, then the same thing would happen to the other two. Although he didn't actually plan to hit this guy that hard, it was an accident, and now he understands more than ever how important practice is. The 2 guys who remained began to talk about how their opponent was able to throw a stone so quickly that it was impossible to react. Even though Vardanaz, they still could not believe that he already possessed such strong magic. Likan was still thinking that he didn't plan to get to this point, but still he had to tell them that if they wanted to die, they could come closer and not be shy, while he maintained a calm appearance, as if he was really ready to destroy them. The ogre simply couldn't believe his eyes. What did he just see? Likan didn't even notice how Dioju approached, but still decided to check with him. Or did he also not come to fight with him? The ogre immediately told him that he had come to help him, and Lee Khan simply could not believe his ears. Did Giselle really treat him like that? The thing was that the White Tiger Tower is different from his Blue Dragon Tower, because all the houses in their tower are quite powerful, so living there is more like a social event. But what confused Lee Khan most of all was that a certain hierarchy had already been established in the White Tiger Tower so early on. While Lee Khan was thinking about this, Dyudgu drew him the same Giselle they were talking about, so that the guy would roughly understand who they were talking about. Lee Khan couldn't quite believe that this was the same guy he saw at the fencing lesson. From the first meeting, it seemed to him that this was a good-natured guy, but now he understands perfectly well that appearance can be deceiving, and the ogre could not help but add that in the case of Giselle, appearance and character are not connected at all. Although the ogre still didn't understand why Lee Khan even calls Giselle a guy. Lee Khan at that moment continued to think about his own things, and it seemed to him that he had found the reason why he was treated this way. It was strange for him that they reacted to the duel like that, but the ogre only confirmed that the duel was actually just an excuse, but there were many reasons why they did so. And the very first and probably the most important is that Lee Khan from the house of Vardanaz and the ogre believed that this was why they started hunting him. After all, if Lee Khan, a native of the great house, could be defeated, then the authority among the first years would greatly increase. Now the guy understands that Giselle essentially just considered him a trophy with which to raise his authority. Duju suddenly decided to say that what really bothered him the most was that Lee Khan would most likely continue to show his good side, and then the students from his tower would feel hostility towards him. And people like Giselle know how to kindle such emotions in such people. At least, that's what the ogre thought, who told Lee Khan all this with the idea that he would just know this and be careful if he still decided to continue attending fencing. While Lee Kok was walking home after this hard day, he couldn't get out of his head the thought of how Dyudgu told him that he needed to try to avoid the subjects that White Tiger students attended. Then Giselle would not be able to do anything to him. Lee Han, of course, was not going to argue that this was a good proposal, but he already knew that he would not even think about following it. And the first reason was that it is quite difficult to find a good subject in Lee Khan's understanding, and the second reason was his pride, because he did not understand at all how they dare to play political games with him. Therefore, without thinking for a long time, he decided to answer them in kind, so he entered the restroom and told the guys that he was attacked by students from the White Tiger Tower. And according to him, they did this only because he was from the Blue Dragon. Mentally, Lee Khan was proud of himself, and he wanted to see how they would react to this. His friends couldn't even believe it. It seemed to them that these guys were completely out of their minds, because there was simply no other reason why they did this. One of them even suggested that everyone should not sit here just like that, but call everyone upstairs, because it seemed to him that this was no longer a joke. It would be nice if they raised their hand against Ganando, but they must avenge Lee Khan. Ganando didn't understand at all what he had to do with it, and why wouldn't anyone marry him like that? Lee Khan couldn't even imagine that they would be so angry. It's even more than he thought. This even crossed some normal boundaries, because they were going to contact the others, and even some offered to find weapons. Apparently now Lee Khan will have to calm them down, if of course he manages to do this. But they didn't seem to listen to him at all, because they believed that they all owed him here and should do everything to help Lee Khan. They were still grateful to the guy for bringing meat for them, and it was Lee Khan who saved them from hunger. The guy, of course, could not tell them that it was simply his plan on which he made good money, and at that time, they continued to gather. Now that there were enough of them, they were ready to go and kill these arrogant students from the Tiger Tower. Lee Han at this time could not believe that he had made such a mistake in his calculations, and underestimated how much the Blue Dragon Tower hated the White Tiger Tower. Although, on the other hand, there was nothing unusual in this, and it is quite natural to hate someone in whom you increasingly notice your equal. Suddenly, at one moment, their hike was stopped by Asan, who asked them to stop and listen to him before going anywhere. After which he tried to explain to his friends that one should not act rashly, because people from families of knights live in that tower, and if they rush there emotionally, they will definitely lose. Lee Khan completely agreed with him, so he supported him with both hands, saying that he was indeed right. But apparently the guy was a little hasty with conclusions, because before he had time to say that they could just leave it alone, Asan simply shouted that they needed to set up an ambush and then attack. Now he understood that it was incredibly stupid to hope for anything. They succumbed too much to emotions. So he had to intervene and tell them straight out that he wasn't asking them to actually avenge him. Lee Kun asked them to understand that this matter concerns exclusively his honor, and therefore only he himself will deal with it. But his friends still believed that they were cunning, mean, and petty, so it would be difficult to deal with such scum alone. Lee Kun, in response to this, reminded each of them that they all came from respected families, and it would be incredibly shameful if they stooped to their level. These words made the guys think, and even for a second it seemed to Lee Kun that it worked, but he was not going to dwell on these words. And so he decided to get to the main point, after which he began to say that if they themselves entered into battle with them, then together they would be able to answer them. Lee Kun believed that they were all just cowards, so they would probably attack as a group. They fully supported him and believed that he was right, so they decided that they would stick together and be vigilant. Lee Kun felt better because he managed to avoid the problem of being bullied for belonging to some family, but some guys still continued to say that their next lesson would be with these bastards, and therefore they thought that it would be a great idea to make it so that they didn't just live there. Besides, they had already mastered the light spell, but they definitely hadn't learned it yet. Lee Kun understood what he had done, but he simply could not do anything about it. The next day, Yenna got up early in the morning and wanted to have a little snack before class. But before she had time to wake up, she was frightened by Lee Kun, who apparently had not slept all night, because he could hardly say good morning to Yenna. And so it turned out, according to Lee Kun, he did not sleep all night because he was practicing magic. And it was all because he found out yesterday that everyone had already mastered the light spell, but he hadn't. And for Yenna, this really wasn't a good reason to stay up all night. Suddenly their conversation was interrupted by Ganando, who was also awake at such an early hour. But before they had time to call him to them, the guy suddenly pulled out various kinds of food from under his cloak, which was strung on a stick, which he wanted to fry a little over the fire and then successfully eat. Lee Kun decided to approach him carefully and scare him a little, and he managed to do it quite well. Gainando immediately wanted to know when they even arrived, to which Lee Kun told him that they were already here when he took out his sausages. But the guy continued to prove that this did not happen, and it just seemed to them that instead of answering, Lee Kun asked Gainando to remove his sausages from the fire, otherwise they would burn. Although what bothered him most now was the fact that everyone had gathered around rather unexpectedly, and they were all so strange. Yenna believed that they were simply all hungry, and if they had not sold them meat then, it would have been even worse now. Lee Kun thought about trying to make provisions, but the problem was that they had very little food left. And they also understood perfectly well that Professor Yurgulm is quite stingy, and even if they try to take some ingredients from his house, he will be, to put it mildly, evil. They both understood that it would not be possible to endure it on the sly, and it was also impossible to come up with a way to do it. Professor Garcia takes an interest in her students, so she immediately noticed the unusual changes that occurred in them. Firstly, it was noticeable to the naked eye that a week after admission, they were too hungry. Secondly, there was tension in the relationship between the towers. She, of course, understood that everyone had different backgrounds, so the competition was fierce, but the tension between the blue dragon and the white tiger was even stronger than usual. But on the other hand, she did not forget that the director always said that the more they compete, the stronger they will become. Although she could not completely agree with him on this matter, it was also difficult to say something to the director. She would really like them all to get along with each other, because then it will be much easier for her to talk to them. Garcia began by saying that last time they studied the light, and therefore she would like to clarify whether someone had mastered it, and Lee Kun raised his hand without hesitation, although he did not even look at who was raising it with him. At that moment, he thought that after spending the whole night studying it, he somehow succeeded, because he did not want to lag behind the others. But it took all his strength. But at some point, his thoughts were interrupted by the realization that except for him in the entire lecture hall, no one else was holding his hand. He didn't understand what was happening because it seemed to him that they had all already mastered the light, as they said, but they only admired his talent. Lee Kun immediately leaned towards the same guy who had boasted to him that he had already learned the light. This guy answered him with a smile that so far he had only understood the basic principle, but had not yet mastered the spell itself. But he believed that he too would soon succeed. Lee Kun now understood what was happening, and he did not understand how he could fall for this, because aristocrats always do this. They would like to show off once again. Apparently he tried in vain, although Garcia didn't think so. because she was pleasantly surprised that at least someone managed to master this spell. But as it turned out, not one person from the Blue Dragon Tower was able to cope with this, but two, and the second was the princess, and it seemed to Likan that he again had a chance to get closer to the princess. Although from his gaze it seemed to the guy that he had done something wrong again. Suddenly Asen called Likan to tell him that it seemed the princess believed a strange gossip about him. If you believe Asen's words, then the essence of the gossip is that they claim that he is only interested in grades, not knowledge. Likan pretended to be surprised, although he perfectly understood that this was not gossip, because he was really only interested in grades, not knowledge. He understood that this was true, and he actually had nothing to say. Although looking at Asen, who was clearly furious, he understood that he clearly needed to justify himself. Asen, in turn, was disappointed in the princess, because the problem is not who spread this rumor, but that the princess managed to buy into such an implausible lie. Although Likan didn't understand him, because here it's really up to everyone to believe it or not. These words once again proved to him that Likan is incredibly friendly. Now he believed that their tower was full of children of great families, but Lihan, for him, was the most noble. Asen mentally asked for forgiveness from his family for not wanting to go to the academy, but now he understands perfectly well why he is here, to find friends like Lian. In any case, the time has come to show them how they mastered the light, and the first was Likan, who did quite well. Next was the princess, who did not lag behind, and she also managed to do it perfectly. Garcia could not even expect such an excellent result, because she, like no one, knew that students rarely master this spell in the first week, so she is incredibly glad that she was able to meet such talented students. However, now she would like to appeal to others, who, according to her, should not be discouraged, and this should only serve as motivation for them to work further. Light magic is the basis of everything. It is like the first step that will allow them to get an idea of what magic is, which is what Garcia was trying to convey to them. At that moment, Likan was not entirely sure that anyone was listening to the woman at all. And he didn't just say this, because it was enough to just look at how they behaved. Garcia also noticed this and, for now, rather calmly asked them all to calm down and return to their seats. One of the students of the White Tiger Tower said that this is actually just a spell and should not boast about it so much. But he was immediately answered from the Blue Dragon Tower, saying that in the White Tiger Tower, there live 0 students who cannot even master such a spell. Garcia heard all this and asked them not to be upset, because this semester they will only study elementary magic, so each of them still has a lot to learn. This pleased the guys not only from the Blue Dragon, but also the students from the White Tiger. Garcia also made sure to add that once they mastered the light, they would unknowingly figure out how to master it along the way. According to her, elemental magic consists of simple elements: water, fire, earth, air, and darkness. And it also includes complex attributes, such as gravitational magic, such as summoning spirits and even assigning their attributes to artifacts. This is similar to learning the 4 basic math operations and using them in your high school classes. Moreover, even after learning basic elementary magic, they will be treated everywhere as a very important person. But it was too early to go that far, so she suggested that for now they take a test that would help them determine their basic element, since only one is suitable for each person. Without hesitation, Garcia hit her stick on the floor and ordered each of them to now use the knowledge they had acquired from the last lesson. After these words, the fire in front of each of them burned even stronger, and it seemed that they would need to defend themselves from it. And only after that, Garcia told them that this time they would need to create not light, but fire. So she asked them to be extremely careful, because unlike light, fire can burn them very badly. To begin with, she asked them to cast a spell, but they had to do it mentally and very slowly, while saying only one word: burn. After which she showed what result they should get, and it was truly magical. Each student was truly impressed by such beautiful fire magic. Garcia was able to create a huge pillar of fire in just 1 second. Even Likan, who until recently did not want to react like a child, but even he thought that this was simply wonderful and magic was truly an amazing thing. After such a master class, Garcia invited each of them to try it themselves. But no matter how hard the guys tried, they weren't very good at it. The fire just didn't burn the way they wanted. What could not be said about Likan, who almost immediately realized that the professor gave them these candles for a reason, because it seemed to him that if what a person is trying to do is close to him, then it would be easier to just visualize it in his head, and then everything would definitely work out. Therefore, he firmly decided that he would try to do this, and at that moment Garcia turned her attention to him. which did not allow Likan to do this, and with the help of her magic, destroyed his candle and asked him not to do this. After which she came closer to him, and for now asked him to hold off on using fire magic, which he did not quite understand. The guy was immediately upset because he had already planned his path to creating cool magic. Garcia thought that he himself understood this, but apparently she would have to explain to him that this was too dangerous in his case. After all, if you just think that the light was so bright that it blinded everyone who looked at it. And Likan realized that if he cannot control the light, but it's another matter when he cannot control the flame, it is much more dangerous, and not only for him. Garcia suggested that he try it when his senses become more subtle, but for now she suggested that he practice with water magic, because at the moment it is much safer. The professor believed that water, like fire, is a basic element, but Likan didn't even let her finish before shouting that water is not as cool as fire, and he first of all wanted to practice with fire. Although then he quickly decided to take back his words, because he remembered who he was talking to and, moreover, a law professor. Now the fire is really very dangerous for him. He wanted to work with fire so much because it, like lightning, is good for attack. Earth and metal seemed ideal for him to defend himself with. But the water was completely unremarkable for him, and he did not even know where it could be used. The only advantage that Likan saw in water was that it can be drunk at any time, but that's all. But unfortunately, he couldn't do anything about it, because it was all for safety reasons. Although Asan, for example, did not think so, he was even a little envious that Likan would receive special knowledge from the professor. Likan mentally asked him to be silent, although outwardly he tried not to show how angry he was. Concentrating a little on the water, Lika tried to cause a splash of water, which in its nature should be similar to the burning of fire. But mentally his concentration was with fire, because he so wanted to study it, so some anger reigned inside him. And this caused a rather unexpected result for both Likan and the other students. He literally managed to create a huge water ball. It was quite incredible because Likan managed to do it in just 3 attempts, and for a first-year student, this is an excellent result. Garcia was so happy to observe such things, and now she was sure that the guy had a certain connection with water. Moreover, she could say with confidence that Likan had succeeded in elementary magic, so they could calmly applaud him, although for them it was quite expected, given the kind of family he came from. Everyone had fun except the guys from the White Tiger Tower, who didn't understand how Likan managed to do it so quickly. Garcia, in turn, asked them not to be upset and to be patient a little, because she was sure that each of them had a connection with a certain element. It was known that students who grew up in a forge have a connection with fire. Those who grew up near a river or sea will be associated with water. The guys who lived in open spaces where there are strong winds will actually be associated with the wind. Also, the professor immediately noticed to him that the better they are connected with an element, the easier it is to visualize it. And all this was quite strange for Likan, because he had never been so closely acquainted with water, so he did not understand why it was so close to him. Although he still thought that if the opportunity had turned up, it would most likely have been waterboarding from the professor in a past life. At some point, his thoughts were again interrupted by the princess, who for some reason looked at him with an incredibly strange look, which was strange for the guy. But as soon as he turned to her, she pretended not to even look at him, although Likan was sure that she was looking at him. But the most unpleasant moment was that he was distracted, and because of this, all the water poured onto his head. It was funny to everyone except Likan himself, but still the professor noticed that it was better not to get distracted, because the form might get lost. But so that Likan would not be so upset, she used magic on him in order to dry him out a little, and it seems that she had excellent command of wind magic. Now the guy liked this professor even more. She became like a light to him. Therefore he tried to listen to her every word, and would try to do everything so that next time he would do even better, and he would like to clarify with her how long he needs to hold the form. Garcia told him that usually this should be done until the mana runs out, but since this does not happen to him, she recommended that he do this until the end of the lesson. Likan thought that this was abnormal, and that this was some kind of physical punishment for him. But then he immediately remembered one very important point, because she is part of this crazy school, so she is the same as other professors who have gone crazy. Garcia herself thought that maintaining magic for a long time might seem cruel, like walking on a tightrope. But she didn't just tell him to do all this. At least she believed that Likan should be trained in a certain way. After all, the fact that he was able to create a huge water ball in 3 attempts already means that his talent cannot be described in ordinary words. Moreover, she could not help but think that he was the magician with the largest reserve of mana in history, and this was another reason why she would need to polish and purify this gem, which is called Lihan. The guy himself only became even more convinced that all professors are crazy people, and the guy's misunderstanding of their actions only grew more. But so far, he can't do anything about it. At the next lesson, Likan tried to prove to the professor that all this was too much and asked him to finally listen. But the alchemy professor didn't seem to listen to him at all and didn't fully understand why the guy was even telling him about all this. Although Lihan still continued to say that the princess had succeeded in manifesting fire. His friend Yenna was happy when she realized that she had a connection with the wind. Only Gainando almost burned his wand, but on the other hand, he also has some connection with fire. But what's most important is that he just spent the whole lesson staring at his water and did nothing else. The alchemist suggested that perhaps Professor Garcia simply liked the guy, and so she decided to help the guy with his training. Likan decided to point out that this was probably the same reason why he was spending his precious Friday in this city. The professor didn't understand why he was so unhappy, because as far as he remembers, the guy himself offered to help him. And if you remember, this was the case earlier because Likan actually came to the professor himself and said that he had come to help him with work near the house. And in return, he wanted to ask Mr. to eat some food, and the man was not against this exchange option. Moreover, he wanted to take it with him, but the professor forbade him to do so. While Likan was working, the professor drank tea and thought that Likan was a rather unusual guy, because he simply didn't understand how someone like him could come from the Vardanaz family. In any case, he decided to talk a little with the guy, and therefore asked him if he had any conflicts, for example, with the guys from the White Tiger. Likan couldn't even imagine how this old beetle could have found out. But still, he tried to smooth out all the corners and said that everything was fine in principle. But with the White Tiger, not everything was as smooth as he wanted. And apparently the professor asked this for a reason, because according to him, there have always been such problems with the White Tiger. Every year they arrange something with other towers. Likan told him that he immediately understood that there was a strained relationship between the towers, but he still wanted to know if it was okay to have fights at school when they already had a lot to do at the academy. The professor could only laugh, because it was actually obvious to him that this was not normal, and he immediately advised him to simply ignore them if they tried to start a fight again. It was better, in his opinion, to spend his time practicing magic. Likan didn't want to upset him, but he had already fought with them, which literally shocked the man. This was strange for the man, because it seemed to him that fights usually do not start from the first week, so he was interested to know how this happened. According to Likan, they started this because he attends fencing classes, and it seemed to him that it was too cruel. The professor even choked at these words, and Likan even had to come up to find out if everything was really okay. The thing was that the man didn't understand why he went to fencing in the first place. It's the same thing as invading their territory, so it's not strange that they decided to attack him. Likan still thought that this was complete nonsense, because everyone can choose any additional subjects they want, and if he wanted fencing, then he would go to fencing. The man wasn't really going to argue with him and said that what happened happened. The most important thing is that everything is fine with the guy. But he also did not forget to say that he was not sure about magic, but these guys were definitely good in battle. Likan couldn't help but agree with him, although he still thought that attacking with 3 of them was quite unfair, because it was a little difficult for him to deal with them. The alchemist could not believe his ears that he was even hearing something like that, because he did not understand how Likan managed to remain unharmed. This story made him get up from his seat and tell the guy that there was enough work for today, and now he would go cook lahana. The professor made this decision because he realized that he needed to be extremely careful with this guy, because if he didn't like something, he would come with a sword and kill him. After Likan had a hearty snack, he decided to ask the professor one question, in which he was interested to know whether he himself cares about this place. Did no one else help him? The man answered him that they were all slackers without motivation, so they ran away, but it seemed to him that these were basic skills for an alchemist. In his head, Likan didn't understand what he meant by the word basic. Is it really for him to sweep away all the dust in the hut, clean the cauldron and check the ingredients? All these are basic alchemy skills. But he couldn't disagree with the professor, so he just smiled and told him that he completely agrees with him. Likan decided to change the topic and saw a small area where nothing was growing, and so he wanted to ask the professor to plant something here. The alchemist was not at all opposed to the guy planting whatever he wanted. According to Likan, he would like to plant cabbage or onions, which he liked so much. The professor agreed, but he asked Likan to say that he did not plan to sell them later. Unfortunately, the guy couldn't say this, because that's exactly what he wanted to do, but he didn't understand how the man even knew about it. Do senior students really do the same? The man immediately answered him that he was the first businessman here. There were no others. But in any case, he didn't care, and he told the guy that he could do as he wanted. But the professor himself did not approve of this. But Likan had only one thought in his head at that moment. Would it be possible to cook something with cabbage and onions? Because just gnawing on vegetables alone would be uninteresting. Therefore, he decided to ask the professor directly whether it was even possible to cook something from cabbage and onions. The professor suggested that he prepare a stew with these ingredients, because on the territory of a vast empire, food cultures vary depending on the land. The basis of the cuisine of the western region where the Vardanaz family lives is bread and cheese. Oriental cuisine is close to Korean in taste habits. Likan already knew this. He was more interested in asking the man whether he liked the stew, to which the professor replied that he liked it very much, but he tried not to eat it. This was quite strange for the guy, so he decided to find out what the reason was. The professor told him that this is Oriental cuisine, and he does not like Oriental gnomes. The guy continued to ask him questions. He was interested to know what happened between him and these Eastern gnomes. The man explained to him that the fact is that his distant relatives live there, who always find fault with him when they meet and often do this for no particular reason. And as an example, he decided to tell the story that recently regeneration potions were expensive, and his relatives believed that it was best to sell them. But the professor did not do this, so they began to tell him that this is why he earns so little. Likan realized that it was better to continue this topic, although in his mind, he thought that the people of the East were quite strict people, but he did not expect that they were so strict. When suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a question from a man who wanted to ask the guy what his plans were for this weekend. The guy understood why the man was asking him this question, and most likely the professor wants the guy to come work on weekends as well. Before he could say a word, the man was ready to bet that Likan would now say that he did not have time to come here. But before the guy gives his answer, the professor asked him to think about what will happen to the starving students in a couple of days, although later he still added that there was really no point in worrying about this, because he believed that the student would always find a way to survive. For example, natives of the Black Turtle, in his opinion, will find fruit to snack on. Students from White Tiger Tower will hunt and feed themselves meat. But he wasn't sure about the Blue Tower. It seemed to him that they were thinking too long. But on the other hand, we shouldn't forget that very talented people usually live in this tower, so most likely in just a couple of days they will find a good solution. Likan noticed that the professor forgot to tell him about the Phoenix Tower. What will happen to them? The man believed that this did not apply to them, because they are the kind of people who are not so easily intimidated by hunger, and most likely they simply will not solve this problem. Because in the Phoenix Tower live followers of the Order, who trained to live modestly in the temple, and when things got hard, they just prayed. Likan knew only one thing. He would not want to live like this. This faith is too amazing for him. But for himself, Likan decided that on the weekend he would go hunting and get into a fight again. Then he would try to make sure that there were more friends than opponents. After such an answer, the man believed that he simply did not have the option of not encountering them, but he assumed that perhaps he would not stumble upon them, and perhaps they would also choose a different path. But Likan did not quite understand what he was talking about. What kind of path? The professor, after thinking for a while, finally said that they always have one backup option, which is to simply run away. The School of Magic is an impenetrable fortress, surrounded by walls and enchanted. But despite this, every year someone tries to get out. And so Lihan thought that if you think about what you can get outside the academy, it becomes clear why students have thoughts of escaping. New clothes and shoes, bread, butter, cheese, and jam, and other essential items that provoke students to escape. Suddenly, all his thoughts were interrupted by the professor, who noticed that the guy had that strange expression on his face again, and it seemed to him that Likan was again thinking about something suspicious. But he immediately asked him to wake up, because the reason why tigers always try to run first is that they are very frivolous. Likan wanted to clarify from all this said, or did someone manage to escape? The professor thought about the fact that in fact, some managed to do this, but everything did not go as planned, however. He understood that Likan was unlikely to listen to his advice. So he just turned around and told Lihan to forget about everything they had just discussed and asked his boyfriend to do whatever he wanted. Besides, he believed that it was much easier for young people to overcome difficulties. But Likan understood why the professor reacted so sharply, so he decided to tell him that he actually did not plan to run away, But the man was not going to believe him, because he believed that it was written all over his face. Diuju, meanwhile, stood in a rather strange room and listened as these strange priests told him that he had better concentrate and cooperate with them. But the ogre cannot be deceived so easily, so he asked Li Kan not to go that far. The guy immediately took off his hood, and he was actually not surprised that they failed to scare the ogre. Gainando couldn't believe that they knew each other because he so wanted to scare Choi Duju, but they didn't succeed because of Li Han. The ogre in turn answered them that it was a very bad attempt, if only because for him they were just small squirrels, whom he was never afraid of. This angered Gainando even more, because he was actually very upset to hear such things. Li Kan, while opening the curtains, asked Gainando to calm down and not make a scene out of it. At that moment, Yena suddenly began to say that she had been curious for a long time why Li Han suddenly decided to go so far. The guy explained to them that the point was that the other tigers would misunderstand Choi if he suddenly made friends with the students from the Blue Tower, and in general, it seemed to him that Duju was already in bad standing with them. Choi first of all wanted to say that he was so pleased that Li Han had thought of so many things for him, after which he added that they really thought poorly of him in the White Tiger Tower. But Li Kan asked him not to worry, because he was sure that everything would be fine, and so he thought, because the guy invited the ogre to become his spy in the White Tiger Tower. But the ogre did not like this decision too much, because it seemed to him that this was some kind of dishonorable title. Li Han responded by reminding him that he himself said that he would tell him if Murad was up to something suspicious, but Choi simply wanted a more noble title for his position. While Gainando was listening to all this, he couldn't understand why the ogre didn't like the word spy so much. What was so bad about it? But from just one look from Diuju, the guy understood what the problem was, and immediately agreed with him that if you think about it, it really does not sound correct. Therefore, Li Kan had to say that since he was doing this for the sake of honor and justice, then from now on he would call him a secret informant. Moreover, Li Kan believed that he alone carried this cross in the name of the fight against lawlessness. For the ogre, these words sounded like a challenge that he simply had to accept and do everything to really fight as a secret informant against the evil that had come to their house. In any case, it sounded incredibly worthy to him, and he agreed to be that informant for Li Kan. Li Kan himself was glad that they were able to come to an agreement with him, and therefore he could only hope for fruitful cooperation. While Yena was listening to all this, she seriously thought about what Li Kan was taught at home in the first place. But now it was not so important, and Li Kan invited them to take comfortable seats, because he was going to get straight to the point, after which he told them that the reason why he had gathered them early on a weekend morning was to develop an escape plan from school. Yena and Gainando were incredibly happy to hear this, which could not be said about the ogre, who did not understand what they were talking about and why he was saying all this. Diuju tried to ask him again whether he was serious or if this was just another joke. Li Kan knew that the ogre would be against it, so he prepared 10 reasons in advance that would convince him. But as it turned out a few seconds later, Diuju also really wanted to get out of this prison, and he was shocked that Li Kan also wanted this. The guy understood perfectly well that even though they were knights, aristocratic habits could not be eradicated. The students from the Tiger Tower never knew what hunger was, so it was much more difficult for them to survive it. It was for this reason that they decided that this could not continue, and they needed to go hunting. Besides, the guys from the Blue Dragon succeeded, so they can too. In addition, they really wanted to wipe these bastards' noses, otherwise they were very proud of the fact that they were good at using magic. But this riot was interrupted at one point by Giselle, who for now quite politely asked them to calm down. After which he added that hunting is of course good, but he also asked them not to be so frivolous, because they forget that hunting in these places is quite difficult. He decided to remind them that Li Kan destroyed the boar that the professor had released, and in order for them to destroy such a thing, they would need to go deep into the forest, and Giselle was not entirely sure that they were ready for this, because at least these lands were unknown to them. Therefore, one of them at one point decided to ask if he had any ideas then, because they simply had nothing to eat. Giselle answered him with a smile that he had one very interesting idea that they would most likely like, after which he invited them to leave school. But first of all, he wanted to make sure that they would stop even thinking about buying meat from those bastards from the Blue Tower. Still, they believed that this was not entirely possible, so they doubted his plan. But according to the guy, he planned everything a long time ago, so there's no need to worry. And now, first of all, he invites each of them to join him because in no case is he going to monopolize this opportunity. However, he immediately warned them that they would have to obey his orders because he did not want the plan to be ruined due to stupid disobedience. Morad listened very carefully to all the words of Morad, who was ready to fulfill his duty to Likan. The guy couldn't believe the ogre's words and decided to ask him in response, what does he think? If he also follows all the orders, will he be taken to the team? Dyudgu expected a slightly different reaction and didn't quite know what to answer to this because he didn't understand how a guy could ask something like that after everything Giselle had done to him. Likan laughed because it turned out to be a joke and he decided to poke fun at him again. In any case, it's time to move on to the plan, and initially Likan planned to devote time to finding a way to escape, but judging by the kind of professors here, it will be quite difficult to do this. But Morad had already said that he had some kind of plan, and this prompted Lihan to think that there was a loophole somewhere that he simply did not see. In addition, Morad is clearly not such a simple person as, for example, Gainando, and it will be much more difficult to deceive him. After all, he is smart and cold-blooded enough to take advantage of the students in his tower, and since the beginning of the semester, Lihan was almost sure that he had some reason to be overconfident. Therefore, it seemed to Lihan that they simply had no other choice but to simply follow him and find out what his plan was. Doge immediately thought this idea was incredibly stupid and incomprehensible, so he reacted that way. Lihan didn't understand why he was so angry and immediately wanted to know if he had a better idea. The ogre thought that this was a little shameful, so he reacted. Likan immediately asked him to think again, but at the same time added to him that now he and Morad are on opposite sides of the barricades, but Dyudgu did not fully understand what he was trying to convey to him. After which Likan told him that there is an expression, know your enemy as you know yourself, and now it seems that the ogre began to understand what Likan was telling him. Likan, putting his hand on his shoulder, said that this is his strategy, and he believes that at the moment it is the only one. In the eyes of the ogre, Likan was like an angel and he simply could not refuse him. It was too convincing for him. Therefore, he still answered Likan that it seemed to him that this could still work, and they should try to do it. Well, since the ogre agreed to such conditions, then Likan, without thinking for a long time, decided to send him to monitor Morad, and as soon as he finds out something about his escape plan, he will need to immediately report it. Likan also did not forget to add to Dogyu that he is not only a great warrior, but also an honorable informant, and made it clear to him that his mission begins right now. The ogre simply could not refuse the guy, so he told him that he could rely on him. As soon as the doors of the room closed, Likan immediately said that now they need to come up with another escape plan, while Daju is busy spying. But first, Yena and Gainando would like to ask Lihan if he was brainwashed before entering the academy. That same day in the evening, Lihan gathered all his friends in one place, and was grateful to each of them for coming to their first meeting regarding the escape. But that's not why Nilya came here. So it wasn't surprising that she was so surprised. Besides, she thought it was completely crazy. She completely thought that they would go hunting or something like that. Likan immediately began to calm her down and say that there was no need to worry, because he had a plan that would help them do this. Looking at him, she herself understood perfectly well that Likan from Vardanaz's house would hardly have gone for it without a plan, because she believed that he was really different from other students. Therefore, she wanted to quickly find out this plan of his, and for this she asked directly. Lihan began to talk about how there is a student from Tiger Tower who knows how to escape, so they will follow him and steal his plan. Although Nilya put on a joyful face, she mentally couldn't believe what was happening here. Was this really Likan's plan? Yena noticed a drop of doubt in Nilya's face, so she decided to pointedly ask Likan if it was possible to carry out his plan without Nilya's participation. Likan immediately changed his face and began to say that without the girl's participation, everything would go wrong for them. So they need her more than ever. He also added that their strategy is based on the ability to track and the instincts of a hunter, and the only person who has this skill is Nilya. But Yana made it clear to her that they couldn't force her or anything like that, and she could decide for herself. But they would be so sorry if she didn't agree. This was the simplest manipulation technique that Yana managed to learn from Likan. And this simple technique worked perfectly. The girl agreed without any problems, because she considered herself very important in this regard, and since they cannot cope without her, then she simply has no other choice. Morad, meanwhile, in the dark forest, turned to his allies and friends who had gathered here and swore to carry out his orders, and was glad to announce that today they would leave this place. They were so happy to hear this, so they fully supported him and were ready to follow him. Well, since they were ready to do this, Murad saw no reason not to hit the road, and he was so confident in his success only because he had this map with him, which would help him not to go astray at one fine moment. Giselle, a month before entering the academy, sitting in his palace, forced his courtiers to bring him something more useful because there was simply no benefit from what they brought to him. His servants immediately turned around and went to carry out his order, simultaneously asking him for forgiveness for what they had done. While he was waiting for them, he decided to delve into the books that they had already brought him, and at some point found a piece of paper, on which it was written that this is a map that will help escape from Einregard Academy, and there was also a message from the first owner, who wrote that the one indicated on this map is the only way. This is the best road that he and his friends found and used to escape. Then Giselle thought that this was needed only for those who could not cope with the program at the academy, but now he was glad that he still took this card with him. Likan finally informed his friends that they could move out, and it seemed that the cost would not be as simple as it seemed to Likan, because they were clearly going to climb the mountain. Gainando still didn't understand why they were going to the mountain, because it was so dangerous there, and besides, there was a passage next to the castle gates. Likan decided after these words that he decided to ask Dajiu to look after Gainando, because for some reason, it seemed to him that the guy was afraid to go with them. The guy didn't understand at all why this was said and what does it mean that he leaves him to Dajiu. Likan decided to explain to him that, for example, Nilya is extremely good at climbing mountains. She and Dajiu are confident in their endurance, and Yenna is accustomed to mountain paths, as she often walks along them. But as for Gainando, Likan believed that the guy was not at all suited to climbing mountains. After some time, Likan still turned out to be right and Gainando could hardly talk, and then constantly asking only for water, which is what Likan said. But now he understood that this was not really that important, and the thought was constantly circulating in his head that walking along unfamiliar mountain paths was quite difficult and incredibly dangerous. The only fact that pleased him was that Nilya was with them, because without her, they would hardly have been able to track down the White Tiger guys. It even seemed to Likan that he himself was of no use either. But he was not upset about this. But it was better to write down everything that was happening around him. He had acquired such a habit from his previous life. When suddenly Nilya screamed and ordered everyone to stand, it seemed she heard the danger. She explained to them that the tigers were behaving quite strangely, because at one point they simply stopped and apparently did not fully understand what to do next. Ganando suggested that perhaps they had already reached their destination, and he did not forget to notice the fact that it was much easier than he thought. Likan understood that it couldn't be that simple, and most likely something just happened. Suddenly, goosebumps ran through his body, and a very terrible wind enveloped his body, and this could only mean that danger was very close. The guy suggested that these could be monsters, but Nilya assured him that there were no monsters here. At least she checked everything in the area. Likan seemed to have begun to guess what was going on here, and simply hoped to the end that his assumptions were wrong. But when he heard the director's voice, he realized that apparently, to his great regret, he was right, and according to the Lich, it was just a trap into which they all successfully fell. After which he immediately turned to Giselle and said that he had in his hands one of the fake cards that he had distributed throughout the academy. It was incredibly difficult for the guy to believe this, because it seemed to him that he had received it before coming here. But apparently all this was just a trick for the students, which the director came up with. And today, for this mistake, they will all receive a life lesson that they will not forget for the rest of their lives. But first, the director decided to tell them that in the future, they should never trust cards of unknown origin, because you never know whether it is a treasure map or a trap set, for example, by an evil lich. Likan, who carefully watched all this, understood perfectly well that in fact the director did not care at all about training. He was just a crazy person who enjoyed punishing people. But the director was not going to stop there and said that now it was time for them to return to the academy. Although they won't be able to do it just like that, and he guarantees it to them, after which he ordered them to avoid their pursuers, who will hinder them as much as possible from getting to the academy safe and sound. The director allowed them to use any methods that would help them defeat the ghosts, if of course they could do it. But he also immediately warned them that if they were caught, they would be found guilty and receive their well-deserved punishment. And if they don't catch them, the director promised to pretend that he didn't even see them here, so everything is in their hands. First of all, the guys chose the option of escaping because they believed that there was no point in fighting these monsters because they were too weak. Lee Khan's squad also decided that it would be best to run away too, although Lee Khan was a little confused about what was happening. But it seemed so only at first glance. He grabbed Nilya's hand and asked her to be quiet, because that way they could be heard. She didn't understand how he could be so calm, because it seemed to her that if they were caught, then it would be the end for them. Lee Khan believed that in fact everything was fine, because it seemed to him that they didn't even notice them, and if they caught them, then in the worst case, they would just have to stay in the punishment room. This is a room with instruments of torture, from which it is impossible to choose. Well, at least that's how Nilya imagined this room. But Ina calmed her down, saying that she actually has a very wild imagination, and this room, according to her, is not as scary as its name. Lee Khan at that moment was standing behind a tree and looking at these demons. He tried to come up with an option that would help them get out of here, but so far nothing had come to his mind. Suddenly he heard a voice that suggested getting into formation, because this is the only way they can destroy them if they suddenly want to get closer. And this was the voice of the guys from the White Tiger, who realized that simply running away was not an option, and therefore decided that they should try to fight them. The viewing of this strange picture was suddenly interrupted by Dojyu, who approached Lee Khan with the words that he actually saw only one way how they could get out of here. And to do this, they will need to close their eyes to all differences and rally forces for their common goal. Lee Khan actually completely agreed with him, and could not help but tell the ogre that this was a rather deep and correct thought. After which Lee Khan added that as long as they bought time for them, they would be able to fulfill their part with the escape. They were all in favor, except for Dojyu, who did not mean this at all, but simply could not say anything against it. Lee Khan believed that first they needed to break through the weakest part of the encirclement, and fortunately the tigers bought them time. But the problem was that the director did not stop and continued to summon monsters, and there were too many of them. The guy thought that this was some kind of test, since they wouldn't be blamed if they didn't get caught, but it seems that the director initially had no plans to let someone get away, and he would do everything to make sure they fell into the trap. Although Lee Khan still harbored hopes that the director simply thought that this level of difficulty was just right for them, so he continued to summon monsters. His thoughts were literally torn between trying to escape again or just going to surrender, because those who split up or tried to escape had already been caught a long time ago, and it was unlikely that they would be able to do anything about it either. After some time of observation, Lee Khan noticed one very important thing, namely that the pursuers were not interested in this direction, but he did not understand why. And one of the reasons for this behavior may be that the director simply did not notice them, and then they have a greater chance of getting out of here unnoticed. There was complete chaos going on in Lee Khan's head, until the thought came to his mind that the director was not actually here, just like when he and Asen climbed into his nightstand, and his clone or illusion appeared. And if Lee Khan is right, then they will only have to run in the opposite direction to the White Tigers to remain unpunished. In any case, he understood that in fact they had no other option, so the first thing he decided to do was tell his friends that he had figured out how they could get out of this trap, which at first made them very happy. But they had such a positive mood exactly until he said that they needed to climb further into the mountains. Half an hour later, they continued to walk high into the mountains, which seemed quite strange to them, but they had no other choice but to listen to Lee Khan. Nilya continued to do her work, and once again reported to Lee Khan that there should be no monsters ahead, so you can continue walking. They walked a little further, and Lee Khan decided to arrange a short halt so that everyone could rest and recuperate. Yenna was still a little nervous that skeletons might follow them, but Nilya calmed her down, saying that she had already checked several times and there should be no pursuit of them. Dudgu intervened in this dialogue, and it seemed to him that the main problem was that it was unclear how long the director would call them, so it was not entirely clear how long they would have to sit here. And it even seemed to him that perhaps he should have broken through them in order to divert their attention in this way. Lee Khan, in response to this, immediately told him that even in this case, they would hardly have managed it, because there were too many of them. And now he suggested not to think about it, but rather to eat a little, and Gainando was the first to support him in this. Nilya, for example, wanted to drink more water, but to her great regret there was no more water. But Lee Khan didn't think so, who used magic to create a small tide that filled her water bag. Nilya couldn't quite believe that he used water magic. She had only heard about it, but in life it was even more beautiful than she could have imagined. Now the girl would also like to take possession of it, because this way, it could be useful to her on the hunt. Suddenly, her surprise was interrupted by Yenna, who asked someone to light a fire because she was incredibly cold. And Nelia, who had only recently mastered the magic of fire, coped with this task perfectly. But even in this case, the first time she managed to create a fire, next to which they can now warm up a little, after which she told Lee Khan that she was a little jealous of him, that he possessed water magic, and she would also like to learn more about this magic than fire magic. Lee Han didn't expect to hear something like this, so he even cried a little about it. He did not explain the reason why he was crying. Lee Han simply told the girl to be grateful for the magic that she possesses. Having warmed up a little near the fire, Lee Khan and Nelia decided to go away to see if the director was still calling monsters, and what was Lee Khan's surprise that this psychopath was still calling them. But Nelia was only worried at that moment that the guy was calling the director names, and it seemed to her that you definitely shouldn't do that. Lee Khan turned to her and said that she must understand one very important thing, namely that magic comes from a free mind, so he asked her to never restrain herself in expressing herself. These words made her stop being afraid of the director, so she, without much fear, shouted that the director was an evil person whom the world had not seen, and she also believed that this crazy skeleton would be eaten by wolves. But at some point she was frightened by a voice and she immediately fell into Lee Khan's arms with the words that she was very sorry for saying that. She convinced everyone around that it was said solely on emotions. Lee Khan couldn't believe his eyes at that moment, and neither could Giselle. They both didn't expect to see each other here. After a short conversation, Lee Khan invited them to go to their small hut so that they could rest. Gainando was the only one who did not understand why these people were allowed to come to them, since they already had little food. Although Duju asked Gainando to be quieter with such expressions, he himself mentally thought that Lee Khan had the right to ignore them because of what happened. But even in this case, he treated them well, for which the ogre had great respect for him, because he himself would hardly have been able to do this. Giselle decided to accept this help, but until the very end he was haunted by the question of how could the dragons end up here. He assumed that they could have the same map as his, although he does not even consider the option that they could follow him. Morad did not fully understand what he could do with this and what to do next, because he was embarrassed by the fact that Lee Khan helped them so much and did not leave them in trouble, although he had every reason to do just that. But even taking all this into account, he still remembered the words of his father, who told him that their family always remembers all the grievances, so it seemed to him that Lee Han simply had an ulterior motive to do this. Although, on the other hand, his father also always told him that they pay for kindness only when they remember it. Based on this, Morad decided to establish a good relationship with the guy, after which he could take a little time to decide what to do next. But before he had time to ask what happened and how they ended up here, suddenly one of the White Tigers guys fell unconscious. This scared everyone because it was very unexpected and no one fully understood why this guy suddenly lost consciousness. But as soon as Morad looked at the other guys from the White Tiger, he began to guess what the reason was. Therefore, he immediately turned to Lee Khan, and looking into his face, he could not believe that the guy was capable of such a thing. But Lee Khan could only say that it was too late to change anything, and he really poisoned the water they drank. A few seconds later, Giselle fell unconscious on the floor, without having time to say a word. Lee Khan was so happy about this because now they could get rid of another problem. He understood that it might seem like he had crossed a line, but the guy was convinced that if someone hated him for no reason, then he should create that reason. His friends immediately started shouting at him because they didn't understand why he did it, because they also drank this water. Would they also lose consciousness now? It was so funny for Ina and Nelia to watch their hysterics, because in fact they just passed out and no one poisoned any water. Gainando couldn't believe that they both knew about this, but Lee Khan didn't specifically warn the guys, because he understood perfectly well that they would ruin everything with their inept attempts to repeat themselves. Moreover, he did this not out of personal motives or desires. He believed that it was literally necessary to do it. After which he asked Gainando and the ogre to calm down, because they did this only to place their bodies near their pursuers. Dyudgu still did not believe that they could go so far, but apparently it will be so. Lee Khan, to be honest, didn't understand why the ogre was so surprised by this, because he, like no one else, knows what kind of person Morad really is, and on the one hand, the ogre agreed with him. In any case, he wanted to know where they got the sleeping pills. Yenna said that when they were on the road, she noticed a sleeping herb among the bushes, which, according to her, can be ground into powder and mixed with water, after which this drink will make you want to sleep. So Lee Khan decided to take a little of it. because he was sure that they would need it in the future. But she didn't even expect that they would need to use her in such a situation. After some time, the bodies of the guys from the White Tiger were taken by the director's hunters, and now they will all definitely face punishment. Lacan was glad that their tactics worked, and thus, most likely, these guys will leave soon and they can safely return back to their tower. But before that, he offered to complete the remaining task, and he wanted to check this territory. Since they were already here, he believed that they should take the opportunity and do it. He was quite interested to know how far the wall of the academy stretches, for example. And is there really no way to get out of here? They walked for several hours without rest, and it seemed that with every effort their strength was becoming less and less. They never learned anything new. At some point on the road, Ganando began to scream very loudly, and it seemed that something incredibly terrible had happened. But as it turned out, he just hit a stone. But what's even worse is that he really wants to eat. Likan understood that they were not exaggerating, and looked at the ogre, who was also tired. Nelia suggested that he turn on the light, because it seemed to her that hardly anyone would notice them here, and besides, it seemed to her that they were even more tired because they were walking in complete darkness. Likan decided to listen to her and turned on the light, which was like a fresh breath of air. Now it was so light around, and it even seemed like it was a normal sunny day outside. But at some point, Likan heard a voice inside his head, which asked him to turn off the light because it was preventing him from sleeping. Although, as it turned out a little later, this voice was heard not only by Likan but also by his friends, who were no less scared for him. This terrible voice asked them to be quiet and not shout. Besides, only he asks all the questions here. After which he added that if they could answer correctly, he would accept them as his guests, and if incorrectly, he would consider them intruders. Without waiting for their answer, he began to tell his riddle. At night, the man lit 5 candles. Although almost immediately 2 of them were blown by a strong wind. The distressed count closed all the windows in the room, and now the most important question is how many candles are left to burn. Likan listened carefully to every word of this riddle and understood perfectly well that it had a trick, and all that remained was to find this catch. If you don't really think about it, the answer will be 3, but the candles get smaller and go out over time. Therefore, it seemed to him that as soon as morning came, not a single candle would burn. But before he could say this, Gainando decided to give the answer to this riddle himself, and his answer was 3 candles. Likan immediately started shouting at him and asked him not to interfere, but suddenly this strange voice answered Gainan that he was absolutely right, and the answer was really 3. This led Likan to a dead end, because this guy didn't even try to think, but simply said the most obvious answer, and so he decided to ask this mysterious character, "Won't the candles gradually go out on their own?" But it seemed obvious to the voice that this count from this riddle used magic to prevent the candles from going out. Now, Likan understands, because he did not take into account the fact that they are in the magical world. In any case, this was the correct answer, and in theory they should become guests for this voice. But apparently it won't be that simple, because he invited them to solve another riddle, and if they answered it correctly, he would reward the one who gave the correct answer, and Likan agreed to these conditions. Gainando and Yena also did not mind taking part in this, and the voice happily began to tell the next riddle. It was that there is a man in the world. In the morning he is big, in the evening he becomes small, and at sunset he grows again. But at night he disappears completely. Who is he? This riddle was several times more difficult than the previous one, and the answer had to wait longer. Likan, after thinking for a while, said that the correct answer could be a shadow. And this turned out to be a completely correct answer. The guys could not believe that Likan was able to guess so quickly. In fact, this riddle was not new to Likan, and in his past life he often heard it. Moreover, it was probably the most popular of all. When he was studying history, he read that the riddle of the Sphinx that King Oedipus answered was a little similar to this one, but the answer was not much different from a person. But now it doesn't really matter because the answer was absolutely correct, and the magic tree finally decided to welcome smart guys like them. And a few seconds later, magical butterflies flew around them, emitting such a pleasant light. And the tree also realized that they were most likely all out of the way, and they were probably thirsty, so it invited them to drink a special cocktail, which did not look as attractive as they would like. Likan, of course, was grateful for such a drink, but for some reason he suddenly lost the desire to drink. Although he did it anyway, and the first sip radically changed his opinion about this drink. After all, his body was immediately visited by a feeling of such freedom. The pain in his muscles immediately began to recede, like a glass of clean cold water that you drink after a run on a hot summer day. The other guys didn't quite understand how Likan could easily drink it, because for them it was very disgusting. According to the magic tree, it was tree sap, which Likan liked very much. He even asked for another mug. But before that, the tree asked the guy to introduce himself because he still doesn't know his name. The guy was gladly ready to do this, and the first thing he said was his name, but this was not enough, and the tree asked him to say which guy is at home. But when he said that his home was Vardinas, the calm atmosphere immediately changed to alarming for reasons that were understandable to Likan. Although this was only for one moment, then the tree added to the guy that judging by the fact that he said his first name before his last name, it means that he will definitely become an excellent magician. Now the tree would like to know from them what brought them here in the middle of the night, to which Likan, without much regret, lied that they were just enjoying a night walk, and Yenna simply did not understand how he could lie so easily. But apparently it's not easy to deceive the tree, and it immediately decided to clarify why they decided to escape from the academy a week later. Likan realized that there was no point in continuing to lie, so he decided to say that something just happened, and then he decided to ask this tree for advice. The tree understood what Likan was asking him for, and decided without thinking for a long time to answer him that in fact, there is one way to get out. But for beginners, it is almost impossible, so his advice was not to try to do it. Then, Likan became interested in finding out from him how far the walls of the academy extend. And if you believe the tree, then this is also not something they can find out. Moreover, the tree told them that the walls are enchanted, and they will immediately regret it as soon as they touch them. Now the guy understands perfectly well that escaping through the hole in the fence will be simply unrealistic. His thoughts were interrupted by a tree that asked the guys not to run away from the academy, especially not to do it thoughtlessly. And he thought so, because for now, the forest is calm. But in a few weeks it will awaken, and monsters will appear in it. This was the end of Likan's questions, and he immediately thanked the tree for the information. The tree, looking at the guy at that moment, thought that his eyes were not moving at all, and most likely he was eager to set off. And so the tree was confident that it would be quite fun for him to watch. But still, the tree was not going to let the guy go just like that, so it asked him to stay a little. And the reason was that the tree wanted to give the guy a gift that he deserved for solving the riddle, and it was a small artifact. And as it was known for magicians, artifacts are literally their arms and legs, and among them the most valuable are magic wands and similar items. Now new students are extremely dissatisfied with the chopsticks they were given at school, and at that very moment, Likan became the first of them who was able to receive a new item. As soon as Likan took this artifact in his hands, such a cozy and refreshing feeling immediately spread through his body. The tree at that moment was carefully watching Likan, thinking that he was truly an unusual boy. And it was not just like that, because there are spirits in this staff, and it would be difficult for a child of his age to sense it. The tree also did not forget to tell Likan that the more he uses it, the more he will be able to learn about the powers that it hides. Likan asked him to tell him what was hidden behind this staff, but the tree assured him that there was no need for this, because over time, he would understand it himself. Mentally, the tree continued to think that this guy reminded him of the Vardinas madhouse, whom he met in the last century, although he really shouldn't have expected anything else from the blood of the Vardinas. There was nothing more to add on this tree, and it told the guys that it was time for them to return. But before sending the guys back to the forest, the tree asked Likan not to use magic here, because it could awaken other trees that would not be so friendly towards them. In this case, Likan did not understand how they could get out of here, to which the tree asked him to remember the riddle that they managed to solve. This would be the answer to his question. When they left the territory of the spirits, all the undead had already disappeared, and while the sun was shining, they descended from the mountain. After which they each went to their own room and laid their tired bodies on the bed. But before Likan had time to fall asleep, suddenly someone started breaking on his door and knocking very loudly. It was Arnaz, who asked to forgive him for his rudeness. The matter was not incredibly urgent. According to him, the psychopathic director decided to arrange something outside. Likan realized that apparently he would not be able to sleep today, and the director most likely wanted to identify those students who managed to escape from the undead. Then he decided that he needed to act even calmer, so he replied that he would wake up the guys, and they would go downstairs. After they all got out of bed, they immediately went to the gathering place, where, for unknown reasons, the director organized some kind of celebration. To Likan, it looked like a festival, but he simply could not fully understand what was happening, and what was this festival about. It didn't look like the director was simply trying to discover them, but then the open question remained, what was he up to? Suddenly, Lee Khan's thoughts, and in principle the attention of all people, were attracted by the director, who asked them for a little attention. He wanted to tell each of them that today, priests from the empire came to their school, and first he would like to ask each of them to applaud them. Lee Khan, of course, clapped these people without any problems, but he didn't understand why the director greeted these people so warmly. One of them thanked Director Osu for such a warm welcome, and she was also incredibly grateful to him that, despite being busy training these young talents, he was able to devote time to them. In response, he said that he was very pleased that they, as respected priests, understood his heavy burden. Therefore, he decided that they could convey messages for His Majesty, after which he began to say that they could use additional funding for coverage. But before he had time to finish speaking, a woman suddenly interrupted him and immediately told him that this was actually not within their authority, so she asked him not to even mention it. Now Lee Khan began to understand what was going on. Apparently, in any world, there are people who are ready to do anything for money. After this woman refused the director, she began to tell the students that she was very glad to see each of them, after which she added that they were just simple ministers of different religious movements, and they were very glad to have the opportunity to introduce themselves. But Lee Khan almost immediately realized that they were in fact not simple priests. And he thought so, if only because looking at them it was noticeable that they had an incredibly huge reserve of mana. In addition, by its nature she was different from others to him. But before he had time to think about what it could be, he was suddenly interrupted by the director, who wanted to ask the guy if he was interested in all this. Lee Khan didn't even understand where he came from here, but the director did not pay attention to his fear, and already began to tell him that the priest's mana is so unique that it deserves the title of holy power. Now it was clear to the guy where this feeling came from. As if mana was everywhere, the director was surprised that the guy felt it. And then Lee Khan realized that he had actually said a lot of unnecessary things, but the director himself decided to ask the guy why he was always trying to hide his talents, because it seemed to him that in this academy, there were not even a few people with such sensitivity to mana as his Lihana. The guy himself believed that he still lacked a lot, but the director once again repeated to him that this was not so, and he wanted to convey to the guy that it was time for him to start showing his talents and skills to the fullest. Lee Khan at that moment did not understand at all what this old lich was saying, and what did he want to say by this. Therefore, the guy decided to change the topic a little, and for this, he said that he was seeing priests for the first time. This was not surprising for the director, because he is from the Varnadaz clan, and therefore it was not surprising for him that he had no experience of communicating with them at all. And he explained all this by saying that they are too smart with him, and therefore they have no faith in fate. In simple words, they are too smart to believe in the gods. Lee Khan at that moment remembered that his father really compared the sacred power with the result of an empty, fanatical faith, and taking into account all the rumors that were circulating about them, the guy was sure that they were also talking about how they put the priests outside the gates. Now he has even more I didn't want to reveal my last name to these people. But the director thought that they were really pathetic when they thought that the students would buy into some kind of food. Although looking at all this goodness and the food that these priests brought, Lee Khan decided to ask the director what religions he would recommend to him. Lich did not expect this from the guy. It seemed to him that Lee Khan was listening to everything they were talking about here, but apparently this was not the case. But then the director noticed the fact that the guy said religion, and this gave him the understanding that the guy plans to join several religious organizations. And the guy's smile on his face after these words spoke for itself. Apparently Lee Khan again had a plan in his head that would bring him some benefit. The director had not been so impressed for a long time, because it seemed to him that the guy's intentions were quite obvious. He wanted to join several organizations and profit from each of them. It seemed to the Lich that this was ridiculous, but he still liked it all incredibly much. It was just wonderful. Therefore, the director decided to recommend Oren Preezing to him first. Lovers of self-sacrifice gathered in this group, so he should definitely be warmly received there. Then you can go to Orayan Kalaso. They, in turn, worship a god who loves chaos and change. They will not care whether Lee Khan believes in other gods. He also did not forget to tell him to take a closer look at Orayan Kapolio. Their god is the patron of swordsmen. So it seemed to the director that they wouldn't drive an eccentric child like Lee Khan out of there. While the guy was writing all this down, he couldn't believe that the director found out that he was taking a swordsman's course, although on the other hand, he is the director, and most likely he knows everything and about everything. In any case, Lee Khan understood that in this case things would not go well for him, because in his experience, special attention from teachers had never ended well for him. At this point, his thoughts were interrupted when the director decided to leave and therefore said goodbye to Lee-kun, and the guy in turn could thank him in return. The director also added that he needed to check on the students in the punishment room, and therefore he hoped that Lee-kun would make the right choice. In response to this, the guy wished him a good journey, but only after the director disappeared did Lee-han realize what the director said, and apparently he was talking about the guys from the White Tiger class, so he decided that he should be even more careful. When suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by Yena, who approached him and wanted to know where he was going to go. Lee-kun confidently told her that he was thinking about visiting the Order of Pretzing. This surprised the girl quite a lot, because she didn't even know that he was so interested in church affairs. But he interrupted her surprise to add that then he would go to Caliso and Capolio. Now she understood what he was talking about and what he was really interested in, but she never had time to tell him about it, because Lee-kun decided to ask what was in her basket. Instead of answering, she decided to just show him, and so she took out a piece of cake, which she offered him to eat. Lee-han was shocked when he saw this treasure and wanted to know where the girl got such a treasure, so she had to tell him that it was from the Flemish order, who worship god alchemy. Yena also said that her family had been providing them with financial support for a long time, so they recognized her immediately. It was a little strange for Lee-han because this was the first time he had heard of such a relationship between families and the church. But on the other hand, he was offended that his family did not donate money to some order. At this point, Lee-kun decided to say goodbye to her and went to his destination, where he would like to receive the blessing of Lord Preezing. Those who met him were so shocked that he himself came to them, so they were incredibly happy about it. Other students were surprised when they saw Lee-han join one of these orders, given the rumors about how his family treated priests. But the guy at that moment said that he had actually been interested in their teaching for a long time. They were very happy to hear this, so they did not detain him, and immediately invited him to enter their hut. But what surprised the guy most of all was that one of the priests asked for help from a girl who looked like a half-breed demon. And this was the rarest race among half-bloods. If among a person's ancestors there was someone who entered into a contract with a demon, then there is a possibility that one of his descendants may be affected by a special effect. Usually people judge half-demons for their appearance, but they usually do not reciprocate and simply tolerate insults directed at them. The priest decided to introduce this girl to Lee-han, and her name was Digiling, and she was a new student of the Burning Phoenix Tower. Also, the woman could not help but add that she did not suspect that there would be another believer besides Digiling. In response to this, Lee-han stated that it is simply impossible not to believe in Lord Preezing if you know about his great will. Although the only thing in the guy's head was that there are two most important points when joining the order, and this is what he can get from it. And what will he need to do for this? At first glance, Lee-kun, this order may not look very good, but he was interested in the fact that they have a bunch of artifacts from which he feels mana, and they could be useful to him in the future. Therefore, a question arose in his head in which he was interested to know whether the Order of Pretzing was related to the creation of artifacts, when suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by Madame Madrid, who was called to look at the new potential believer. But as soon as she left her room, Lee-kun began to feel dizzy from some kind of pressure that was incomprehensible to him. And this pressure existed until this woman came close to him and said that her name was Medrid and she was very pleased to meet him. Lee-kun greeted her with a smile, although he mentally did not understand how she, so small, could radiate such oppressive energy. But what surprised him most was that she left incredibly huge traces behind her. Medrid noticed the guy's surprise at her trace, and she immediately decided to tell him that in fact there was nothing to be surprised about, because the fact was that it was because of the artifact that she was using. She also added that it is enchanted and is capable of increasing the weight of the wearer several times. Lee-kun decided to ask why she needed something like that, but the answer did not surprise him, because the woman convinced him that all this was for the sake of the will of Lord Pretzing. He did not expect anything else, but still decided to clarify with her what she meant, to which she replied that in fact Lord Pretzing was the one who took the pain of the whole world. And therefore, according to her, they are obliged to share this pain with him, and this is possible through the use of cursed artifacts. Lee-han for a moment felt like he was just going crazy while listening to all this. He couldn't believe that he actually listened to the director's words and came here. However, she could not help but add that this path was difficult, and she would understand him if he was not ready to do this. But on the other hand, according to her, she could not be sad, because she had actually already prepared a welcome gift for him. According to her, even though it is called an artifact, she doubted that anyone would want to wear something that absorbs mana. Lee Khan was about to leave, but suddenly stopped because he suddenly wanted to know what curse was on this artifact. And he became interested only because he remembered that his weakness was that he had too much mana, and this item could definitely help him. Therefore, he immediately ran up to the woman and wanted to find out from her what about the other abilities of this artifact, because he was sure that this was probably not all that he could do. According to the woman, its main effect is that the stronger the artifact, the heavier the curse on it. This item has the curse of weighing down the body, but also increases holy energy. She also thought it was worth mentioning the fact that it contains the magic of invisibility. But this, it seemed to her, was not the most important thing, because what was more important was that the curse made the bearer's mana weaker. As soon as Lee Khan heard this, he didn't even let her finish, and said that he was aware of everything, and was completely ready for this test. The woman could not believe that he agreed, because she was practically sure that as soon as she told everything about this subject, he would definitely refuse. Now she was even a little ashamed, because how could she not recognize sincere faith in him? She almost cried, and therefore asked him to accept this artifact. And she also added that they would always be glad to see such a wonderful brother in their church. And this artifact turned out to be a belt for those who honor Lord Prezing, and it is this belt that imposes the effect of invisibility. As soon as Lee Khan took this chest, 2 priests approached him, who mentally thought that new followers always suffer from the consequences of curses, and this time, it seemed to them that it would be the same, so they understood that they needed to be more careful. But what was their surprise when Lee Khan put on this belt without much doubt, and immediately wanted to know how to activate its ability? 2 assistants immediately wanted to ask him how he felt. Lee Khan didn't really understand why they were so nervous, because everything was fine with him, and he was feeling well. Medrid could only smile back at him, because at that moment she was thinking that Lord Prezing had actually sent them an amazing student. So she explained to him that there were detailed instructions for beginners on exactly how to use this belt. Lee Khan immediately reached into this chest to get this small piece of paper, and as it turned out, all that had to be done was to ask him to hide it in the night, after which the guy literally disappeared, and now they all understand what this artifact is actually capable of. Lee Khan himself did not expect that this would actually work, but most of all he was surprised that it was not partial invisibility, but complete. Although, on the other hand, this was to be expected from such a powerful artifact, given the curse in it, and all that needed to be said, that this cloak showed him again, was to say open to the bright day. But the problem was that Lee Khan felt absolutely nothing. It seemed to him that there was simply no curse as such, so he decided to tell Medrid that he could take the big burden of their lord. She simply could not believe his words, and could only say that it touched her so much, and Lee Khan in her eyes was worthy only of praise. But still, she tried to explain to him that there was no point in overexerting himself yet. It was too early for him. But Lee Khan continued to insist on his own, so he continued to talk about how he should take away as much of his suffering as possible. As a result of these long disputes, Lee Khan was unable to achieve anything and was allowed to take only 1 belt. But on the other hand, he understood that even this artifact would be very useful during the escape, when suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a phrase from Medrid, who seemed to have finished telling how Lord Pretzing's church was born, after which she added that this should be enough for today. And although Lee Khan did not listen to anything and did not understand anything, he still had to say that he really liked the lesson. Looking at this board, he thought that in the end everything was going as usual, and all he could do was simply wear the curse of this belt and thereby help himself. But before leaving, Medrid decided to stop him and asked him to take a small gift from them, in honor of his courage. And this gift was a small basket, which contained quite a lot of different good products that the guy would definitely need. Now in his mind, Lee Khan believed that coming here was still a good decision. He also felt a warmth in his heart, which he had not had for a long time. But apparently this was not all that they wanted to give him, because at some point a half-breed demon patted him on the back and asked him to take this basket of food as a gift. Lee Khan didn't understand why she was giving it to him, because it seemed to him that it was digiling food. But according to her, she is only a servant of Lord Prezing, and she does not need such wealth. After which, she simply turned around and began to leave without adding another word. On the other hand, Lee Khan understood that nothing else should have been expected from the Phoenix Tower. After all, they are very different from the others. The other 3 towers were doing something, but nothing was heard about this tower at all. As soon as Lee Khan was about to leave, Medrid suddenly turned to him again and asked him for a small favor. This favor was that she would like to ask him to take care of Digiling, because it was immediately noticeable that this child was too cruel to herself. Likan did not quite understand the meaning of this request, because he was at least from another tower. But after the woman gave him another basket of food, he immediately changed his mind, and began to think that in fact there was no difference. After that, Lihan went outside and caught up with Digiling, whom he wanted to talk to. And most of all, he was interested in the question of what it was like to study in the Phoenix Tower, because as everyone knows, they don't really communicate with the other guys, and they are very interested in what they do in their free time. But the answer was too boring because the girl said that they pray in their rooms in the morning, evening, and even sometimes at night. According to her observations, some guys even go to the forest or mountains to pray for the whole night. As far as Likan knew, there was a curfew on weekdays, and it was a little surprising to him that they were allowed such outings. Digiling told him that in fact their tower almost immediately received special permission for such events. This made the guy smile because he realized that believers don't care about the curfew, and this could be played for his own personal gain, and Likan understood this very well. He even thought that if he put on a robe, he would have several times more time for activity. Therefore, he decided not to wait long and immediately decided to ask the girl if he could get clothes for believers. She didn't quite understand why he needed it, because his curse was unlikely to be alleviated by wearing such clothes. Likan immediately made it clear to her that he did not need her for this. As it turned out, he just wanted to better understand the teachings of their Lord. Digiling told him that since he was so inspired, she would have no problem preparing everything for their next meeting. The guy hugged her lightly and wanted to thank her in this way, although the only thoughts in the guy's head were that his escape was getting closer and closer, and soon he would be able to be the first student who could do this. He also decided to ask the girl how they were doing with food lately. Without much doubt, she immediately answered him that she was completely satisfied with what she had now and she would not want to change anything. But Likan reminded her that Sister Medrid was worried about her and that she needed to think about herself at least sometimes. The guy even decided to tell her that Medrid asked him to look after her. These words made the girl a little upset. In any case, Likan had one very interesting proposal for her. He suggested that she eat together at least once, and it seemed to him that this would be quite enough to calm her sister down. Besides, he didn't understand how he could just let go of the person who brought him such a precious gift. So he decided that as soon as they shared the meal, Digiling would feel all the grandmother's care for her grandchildren on Thanksgiving Day. Meanwhile, in the professor's office, the alchemist drank tea and enjoyed the taste, because today it was much tastier than usual. But still, he would like to know why the director gathered them today. Garcia immediately assumed that we would be talking about basic horse riding training. In addition, she herself was interested in the question. Did the director find a teacher for this? The alchemist always thought that this basic training was conducted by Professor Bendosol. Garcia realized that apparently he was not aware, and immediately decided to tell him that Professor Benzol had disappeared while going in search of a unicorn. And judging by the fact that there is still no news from him, Garcia is starting to think about a rather bad outcome. But the director asked them not to worry, because he actually found a teacher for this course. At such moments, each of the professors assured the man that he was indeed the director of the academy. But the alchemist was more interested in finding out who would teach this subject, because it seemed to him that it must be someone very capable, since he would be entrusted with one of the main courses. The director once again assured them that there was no reason to worry, because this person would be the thunderous step of Choi Dar. Garcia was glad to hear this, because she believed that she really could be trusted. She was a fairly experienced magician. They also knew that she was a fairly famous explorer, and if they were not mistaken, it was she who discovered many territories both inside and outside the empire. But not everyone was happy with this decision, so at one point the alchemist still couldn't stand it and started screaming, because he sincerely didn't understand why her. And the reason was that it was Professor Urgalm's aunt, and he didn't love her too much, just like she didn't love him. And all because her whining is so disgusting that even the Eastern gnomes hate her. The director began to say that apart from this story, the only thing he did was hire an excellent professor. So he believed that they just had to take note of this, after which they could all be free. The next day, the students went outside to finally enjoy the new subjects at the academy. Each of them had been waiting for this for so long, because they had heard that basic training in horse riding was simply flawless. Lihan was also among these students, but he didn't understand why they were so lively. Well, he understood that of course there was a reason, because it seemed to him that there would be no problems in this subject, because this is what they were accustomed to since childhood, because horse riding is the basis of every nobleman, and most likely their classes will be even too easy. Suddenly their joy was interrupted by some incredibly vile sound, which at first was coming from nowhere. But as soon as they raised their heads, they saw a huge bird flying straight at them. Although it seems that she found a target for herself that she wants to take with her, and that target turned out to be Gainando, who was screaming and still trying to escape. But all this was useless, because this bird was still able to grab him and take him with him. While everyone was panicking because of this, Likan asked them to calm down and bend down, because as far as he knew, they should not be seen by this bird, so it was better not to even move. Which they did, although mentally Likan still couldn't believe that such things no longer surprised him. But even so, she would like to know where this bird even came from. When suddenly he heard one of the White Tiger students screaming about where the director was and why he wasn't protecting them. Weren't they in the academy, which was completely protected? They immediately tried to calm her down, but she clearly said that they had better let her go, because she was already tired of this school. But apparently her friend was absolutely right when he told her that it was better to calm down now, because the bird's next target was this girl. Today this girl is very lucky that she has such a friend who stood up for her, and it was him who was taken away. Likan at that moment was thinking that this is why he asked them to be quieter, but as usual, they did not listen to him. But still, it was still strange to him that this bird still left the one who made the noise. Although then it finally dawned on him what the matter was. Apparently, it was all about the hair. Therefore, Likan immediately asked them all to cover their hair with robes, because he was almost sure that the bird was taking away those with shiny hair. As soon as Likan said this, he immediately heard a voice behind him, which told him that the guy was truly amazing, and his prudence and quick decision-making were simply divine, and this was a student from the White Tiger Tower. But before he had time to finish speaking, the guys from the Blue Tower suddenly pounced on him and started telling him that these assholes from the Tiger Tower were attacking Likan again. Therefore, they decided that now was not the time to sit back, and they should all get together. And before they could finish speaking, he interrupted them and said that he had nothing to do with Murata, so they shouldn't be so nervous. Moreover, the princess herself stood up for this guy, who said that she would personally be responsible for this guy. And only after that, the guys realized that they really shouldn't shout at this guy anymore, since the princess stood up for him. When everything was more or less over, Likan entered the dialogue and decided to ask the guys how long had they known each other. As it turned out, the guy was a knight of Her Highness, and therefore they had known each other for quite a long time. Likan was a little surprised by this, because he was sure that they were simply not allowed to take guards or assistants with them, so he didn't quite understand what this guy was doing here. But apparently every rule has exceptions. It is not allowed to come to the academy with assistants, but there is no ban on an assistant entering as a student, so all the rules can be circumvented if desired. Thinking about this, Lihan suddenly felt very sorry for Gainando, because he and the princess are both members of the same family, but their attitudes towards them are completely different. When suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by that same knight, who, as it turned out, approached Likan for a reason, but did it purely for the purpose that he had a separate request for him. After which he added that since the bird had now become calmer, they were relatively safe, but he immediately said that they did not know when it would decide to attack again. And he said all this in order to finally ask Likan to lead the students in order to lower her to the ground. For Likan, this was a rather strange request because he did not fully understand who he should lead and what this strange knight actually wanted from him. Apparently, he was the only one who didn't understand what they wanted from him, because at that moment several more guys approached Likan and started telling him that they trusted him and were even waiting to look at their great leader. It finally dawned on Likan what they wanted from him, but he didn't quite know how to tell them that managing a group of kids at school never ended well for him. But they didn't care at all what he thought, because they started chanting his name and thus asked him to finally give the order. A few days ago, Her Highness's knight learned that Likan, and not Her Highness, was in charge in the Blue Dragon Tower, and this made him very angry at times. He literally did not understand how this happened, because Her Highness had always stood out for her leadership qualities, even in her distant childhood. Therefore, he decided that in this case there must definitely be some reason, and he must figure it out himself. And now that he had gotten so close to Likan, the knight wanted most of all to find out his main secret. The knight did not even suspect that the student's trust was bought only by delicious food. In any case, Lihan decided that he simply had no other choice but to act, so he asked his assistants for something shiny. One of the students gave him a small mirror which suited him perfectly, But no one even thought that Lacan would decide to wave this mirror and shout to the bird to come here, because she likes these sparkles so much. The first stage of his plan worked flawlessly, and the huge bird actually flew straight towards him. And now, according to him, was the most important moment, so he asked each of them to prepare carefully. And to do this, he asked them to stand in a row, as if they were building a small wall. The huge bird continued to fly at full speed towards this crowd, and it seemed that now it would simply blow away all the students. But Lacan was still waiting for that very ideal moment that he so needed. And at the very last moment, he jumped right in front of this bird and used light magic to blind it. This worked great, and the bird began to scream, but now it was as if she was doing it in pain. After which, without thinking for a long time, she simply turned around and decided to fly away. Lacan was very glad that he was right after all, when he decided that this was a very large bird, which was actually quite easy to scare. After his plan worked successfully, some of the guys couldn't help but praise him. Yet they were a little doubtful at first, but now they understood that everything was fine. But Lacan was not as happy as the others, because he did not understand what to do with Gainando and that other guy who were taken with him by the bird. But the decision came by itself when he suddenly heard the bird scream again, and then only how Gainando and the second guy fell from a great height right on them. After which this little chick flew to his true owner, who was so glad to see him, although he was scared. But now, according to the man, he is safe, and then they go to these scary students together. Then the most interesting thing begins, because the same new professor who was hired by the director appeared in front of them. Li Han at this moment immediately thought that, as expected, this strange incident was caused by the new professor. But for some reason, she looked so familiar to him, and it immediately seemed to him that she was somehow connected with Professor Urgalm, or that these were just stereotypes. When suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by the same woman who put her hand on his shoulder and declared that he was really good. At that moment, the guy felt déjà vu, because the alchemy professor behaved exactly the same way in the first lesson. All the guys around were quite surprised that this was their new professor. Lacan immediately understood this, so he decided to ask a question in which he was quite interested in finding out whether Professor Urgalm was her relative. This question made her laugh quite a lot, because she didn't fully understand how he guessed, because in fact, she was his aunt. This was quite unexpected for Lacan, but then he decided to calm himself down and reassure himself that he simply couldn't attract the attention of professors anymore. But apparently other guys will do it instead of him, who at that moment approached him and began to tell the professor that he is the best student of Professor Urgalm. The man simply adores him, even often invites him to his place. Lacan immediately turned around and tried to say that this should not have been said, but apparently it was already too late. As expected, these words interested the professor quite a lot, so she immediately decided that she would need to turn her attention to this guy. After these words, Lacan decided to turn around and look at the professor's reaction, and he immediately realized that apparently it was too late to change anything. Therefore, he decided that since the cards lay this way, it would be better for him to make a good impression on her. But before he could say a word, she suddenly began talking about how she was known as a thunderstep. Then she added that this course was supposed to be taught by Professor Benzadal, but he disappeared while going in search of the unicorn, which incredibly shocked the guys. But then they realized that she was the same thunderous step, the great explorer, the same woman who conquered the demon Begaman and opened the crater of spirits. Lacan at this time did not understand why none of them was even embarrassed by the fact that someone had disappeared at all. They only noticed the fact that there was a thunderous step in front of them. She thought that all this was not important, because first she would like to know, or has anyone already guessed why she came to them today with this baby? Li Han, looking at this bird, guessed that the massive body and aggressive maneuverability are abnormal for ordinary birds. In addition, they are able to control thunder, lightning, and tornadoes. Thunderbirds are fearless monsters. But what's most important is that Lacan simply didn't understand how she could bring such a monster. It seemed to him that the Empire should do an inspection at the Academy. Who in the crowd, in response to all these stories, decided to ask or should they learn how to saddle Thunderbirds this semester? This question caused her to laugh incredibly, which did not stop for a long time, because she believed that even in 10 years they would not be able to learn this. After she calmed down a little, she pointed her finger at Lacan and asked him to try to guess why she took this bird with her. The guy thought a little and came up with one answer that might seem correct to him. So he said that perhaps she took this bird here in order to see how they would react to such situations. Her Majesty's knight, who was still standing next to Lacan, thought that this was complete nonsense, because at least this was not a survival course. But as soon as he said this, the woman immediately confirmed that Likan was completely right, and she also did not forget to add that apparently her nephew noticed him for a reason, which greatly surprised the knight. The professor believed that you never know what you might encounter on a journey, which is why constant training is needed. But she didn't tell them all this so that they would worry, because in fact, most of them were concentrating on the riding course. These words calmed the guys a little. After which the woman turned to Likan again and told him that she would now go to the horse stall so that they could all join. And she asked the guy himself to take all the other guys there. She also hoped that Likan would continue to help her during the entire lectures. Likan didn't really understand why exactly he had to do this, but apparently he simply had no other choice, so he had to agree and take the guys away. On the way, the professor told them that the horse is the main animal when it comes to riding, and if a person cannot cope with it, then other creatures will definitely not be given to them. She also did not forget to add that if they want to handle more complex animals, then first they will have to master a horse. But for the guys, it was all very boring and so understandable. Likan, looking at them, was a little surprised that they were all so calm. Although on the other hand, he understood that in fact, they probably rode horses every day before that day. Suddenly, Likan caught the glance of the professor who was smiling at the guy, and for some reason he was immediately struck by the idea that this would be far from a simple horse riding lesson. With these thoughts, they finally reached the stall where all the horses of the academy were located. The guys immediately realized that there were actually only the best horses here, and they couldn't even believe that they would be allowed near such stallions. But before the lesson began, the professor told them that in order to choose a good horse, they must also have certain skills. After which she took out a small glass with chopsticks from her bag and began to say that now she would ask each of them to come up and determine the order. As a result, Gainando, who pulled out the longest stick, won this not entirely exciting game. The other guys simply didn't understand how he did it, because in their opinion, this guy couldn't even tell wheat from straw. But Gainando didn't give a damn about anyone's words, and all he heard were the words of envious people. In any case, he will have to choose the horse first, and therefore he decided that he would choose this big stallion. Likan and Yenna did not quite understand this choice, because it was clear that the character of this horse was clearly not sugar. According to Gainando, the horse should be big, such as this one, which in his opinion is already bowing to him. But unfortunately for the guy, it was just a mistaken opinion, because the horse bent down to strike him. That's why Likan and Yenna didn't really understand his choice, why they chose such a big stallion. They immediately started laughing at him, because they believed that this is exactly what happens when you choose a horse that even looks aggressive. After which one of them added that in fact, good horses are not those that are the biggest. But this guy was also mistaken.